Chapter 410. After solving the emergency in the small town, Tang In and Josiah returned to Stan City the next day. Nothing happened on Old Ron's side. Tang In monitored him for half the night, and the other party drank half the night to drown his sorrows. In the end, he was carried back to his room to rest after getting drunk. This was also a normal result. After all, at such an age, he had long passed the age of impulsiveness. What Tang In did was cruel, but in principle it was not wrong. As for whether he would publicize it afterward, that was not something that Tang In cared about. After returning to Stan City, Tang In's life gradually became regular. There were mainly two things: training himself and training others. Sylvia, Eunice, sang Pooh. After a series of battles, although they were almost killed, Tang In also benefited a lot. Taking advantage of these rare days of peace, he began to pester the old butler constantly, asking for more training. This was not self-abuse. Tang In already had a vague feeling that his strength had almost reached a bottleneck. Once he broke through, there would be a different scene. At the same time, Tang In also had some doubts in his heart. This doubt was mainly directed at the system's space. The system was mainly responsible for imparting skills and issuing missions, and what Tang In had to do was to kill people. If he succeeded, the system would give him a reward. This seemed to be a very simple and reliable business relationship, but Tang In now had some faint doubts. For example, shadow invisibility. After he came into contact with that indescribable feeling of space, a thought popped up in his mind. If he could completely grasp this feeling and freely move through space, then wouldn't he be limited by the buffering time of skills? Or would he not have to waste his blood chi? There were also attack skills such as flowers, storm, air kill, and so on. They were not like games where they could be automatically released with the click of a button. These were all learned by Tang In through his own hard training. He had already mastered body techniques, hand techniques, and so on. In that case, why should he be limited by the system? Could he create one himself? Or could it be that as long as his body could withstand it, he could use the skill again regardless of the buffering time? These thoughts were somewhat abrupt and bold. He had to admit that ever since Tang In arrived in the other world, the system had forcibly changed him a lot, including his personality, habits, and so on. It would be a lie to say that he did not resent it. But at the same time, the system also gave him a lot of help. It could be said that if it were not for the system, Tang In would not have been able to live a peaceful life as a normal citizen in this world where the strong preyed on the weak. By now, Tang In had already gotten used to the existence of the system. He even faintly relied on it. However, a few days ago, when Tang In was playing chess with Josiah, he was tricked by the old butler. After that, he could not help but have these thoughts. It turned out that the system was not omnipotent. It turned out that the system could also be deceived. Could it be that when he reached the level of the old butler, the system could no longer restrain him or control him? Of course, these thoughts were still relatively vague. Tang In would only think of these when he was absent-minded. His main goal now was to improve his strength and strive to break through the bottleneck as soon as possible. As for training others, that was the request that Tang In took the initiative to propose last night. Josiah was very enthusiastic about this matter. In just one morning, he had found more than 20 people. Tang In rolled his eyes and picked out 10 of them. Then, he taught them in different categories. Tracking and anti-tracking were basic knowledge. There were other things like lurking, infiltration, and the awareness that intelligence personnel should have. This kind of training was different from that of David and the others. This time, Tang In wanted to train 10 liars. 10 liars who could handle any situation with ease. Therefore, they did not need to be very strong. As long as they were smart, bold, and careful, it would be enough. Tang In's teaching method was also very strange. The first lesson was to teach them how to commit suicide in various situations. This made Josiah, who was watching curiously from the side, speechless. In the end, he shook his head and walked away. Tang In's regular life thus began. At night, he entered the system to cultivate. During the day, he trained these 10 people. Sometimes, when he needed to combine theory with practice, he would take them to the city's police station, prison, aristocratic gatherings, and so on for a stroll. Something else happened during this time. Tangen's actions in prison were finally partially exposed. It was not Ron Sr. who said it. In order to shirk responsibility, the prison guards in the small town wantonly exaggerated how the Gray Coat Army members killed their own compatriots and so on. This matter also caused some impact. The newspapers in more than a dozen surrounding cities reported it one after another. Josiah also came to ask about it in a roundabout way. Of course, Tang flatly denied it, saying that he was not that kind of person. Josiah might not necessarily believe these words. She was too familiar with Tang's personality and style. She even vaguely felt that the truth was as the newspaper said. However, Tang refused to admit it. He also vaguely reminded her that there was no evidence. Josiah had to let the propagandists fight back, saying that the other party was a thief crying thief. In the end, the matter was left unsettled. This still had an impact. At least during this time, the secret agency personnel in Stan City looked at Tang a little strangely. It was not discussed. After all, everyone knew that this was the principal of the agency. However, the act of killing more than 10 of their companions inevitably made people feel a little uncomfortable. Of course, Tang did not care about this. He even used it as a teaching material to talk to the 10 people about how to deal with it, and so on. In the end, the 10 people all agreed that they should commit suicide before being arrested. This made Tang feel very comforted. He felt that he still had the talent to be an instructor. 1 week, 2 weeks. Time slowly passed in this regular routine. The news of the failure of the third encirclement had not subsided, but the impact had indeed decreased. During this time, there were also some changes in the battle at the front line. In the northern wilderness, a barbarian general called Tiu led a long-distance attack and finally took over the first heavily guarded city in the brand. In fact, although this move was shocking, it was definitely not enough to change the entire battle situation. However, after Tiu took over the city, he caught the personnel of the propaganda office who did not have time to escape. In the end, he forced them to publish a newspaper and wantonly spread it everywhere. Of course, the content was not good. Other than praising himself, the rest was a provocation to the brand. He said that the famous generals were dog sh*t, the soldiers were trash, and that they would be able to take over the entire northern brand in just a few days. The people of the mainland had different reactions to this. Some were panicking, while others were cursing the Blank's army for being disappointing. However, there was a unified statement, which was to ask Z to step out of the Grand Border Fortress and suppress the arrogance of the barbarians. There was a reason for this statement. The northern region was currently bustling with activity, but the Grand Border Fortress was the only place where the barbarians did not invade. It was unknown whether it was because of Z's reputation or some other reason. As such, the Zechen Legion, which was the strongest in the brand, could only stay here and do nothing. Of course, the words of these people would not reach the ears of the higher-ups. Furthermore, even if they did, the Grand Border Fortress was the most important city in the north. Other than Z himself, no one dared to let him lead his troops out of the fortress. Otherwise, once the fortress was breached, the barbarians would be able to take over thousands of miles of land in the north. On the whole, although the Bran Empire was in constant trouble, there were no qualitative changes. Everyone thought that this balance could be maintained for a period of time, but 100,000 Mountain Pass. Although it was called a mountain pass, because it was built on a temporary basis, it was not the military type. There were a few large trees in the middle of the mountain pass, and 10 or so spear-wielding soldiers were leaning against the trees in boredom. There were also a few military tents to the side, and there were about 100 or so soldiers inside. There were many such simple mountain passes in the 100,000 mountains, especially after the failure of the third encirclement. They guarded the path to the outer regions of the mountain, but their goal was not to guard the barren mountains, but to guard the Gray Coat Army's encampment inside. The only difference was that this mountain pass was located at the very front, so there were more soldiers guarding it. It was the same noon, and the gloomy sun was high in the sky. It was the same barren mountains, and the cold wind was blowing. Everything was normal. The soldiers were talking nonsense, as usual, waiting for the shift to change. Then, they would enter their tents and gamble with others. It couldn't be helped. Life here was really boring. Even if they were officers, they could only turn a blind eye to this kind of behavior that clearly violated the rules of the military camp. At this moment, thud, 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 a soldier suddenly frowned, looked at the foot of the mountain in front of him, and then looked again. He turned his head and asked, "Do you guys hear anything? Sound? What sound?" "I think so. The ground is shaking a little." "Is it? This barren mountain. Is it going to be an earthquake?" "Bah, you jinx." A person who looked like a captain was immediately annoyed and waved his hand to smack the back of the soldier's head. "Oh, look at my stupid mouth. Well, I'll climb up the mountain to take a look." The soldier also knew that he had said something wrong, so he tightened his armor and took the initiative to walk to the hill beside him in the cold wind. The hill was not very high, and in less than 10 minutes, the soldier successfully climbed to the top of the mountain. Then, his body suddenly trembled, and he looked forward in a daze. On the long mountain path, countless people wearing all kinds of armor and holding all kinds of weapons were walking over. It looked a little messy, and the soldier looked down from above, as if there was a ribbon wrapped around the mountain range in front of him. But it was undeniable that these people were in good spirits. They walked in an orderly manner, silent, and had an indomitable aura. "Hey, are you stupid? Kid, what are you looking at?" The people below were impatient and shouted loudly, "Gray, gray, gray, gray coat." "Ah!" The soldier's lips trembled, and he quickly turned around. Just as he was about to shout a warning, he stepped on the wind and rolled down the hill. "Ha!" The people below could not help but laugh loudly when they saw his sorry state. This hill could be climbed directly, so the slope was naturally very steep. Even if he rolled down, no one would die. And because of this method, the soldier's speed of going down the mountain was also much faster. In less than 2 minutes, the soldier successfully rolled back up the mountain path with a bang. He did not care about his bruised nose and swollen eyes, and ran towards the tent, shouting as he ran, "The Gray Coat Army is here! The Gray Coat Army is here! Ha! Look at how scared that kid is! The Gray Coat Army! The Gray Coat Army!" Chapter 411. On a certain day in the winter of year 555 of the Brand calendar, this day would eventually leave a deep mark in history, because the Gray Coat Army, the largest independent force in the history of Brand, had officially changed from their previous state of fleeing to taking the initiative to attack. The first to receive this news was undoubtedly the Northern Military Division. The few big shots had different reactions. Some sat behind their desks in a daze, unable to digest the news for a while. Some smashed their teacups and roared loudly about what these lowly people were trying to do. Some simply asked the person who delivered the news repeatedly to confirm if they had heard wrongly attack. They actually attacked. For a long time, most of the Brand nobles and high-ranking military officials had the impression that the Gray Coat Army was fleeing and preparing to flee. The big shots naturally felt that they were on the side of the strong and righteous. As for the inconspicuous Gray Coat Army, they would fight. If they couldn't kill them, they would just leave them be and fight again later. It was just like shooting prey in a hunting ground. It was impossible to kill all of them in one go. But it didn't matter. It was just for fun. But now that the Gray Coat Army had officially launched their troops with the momentum of thunder, they were suddenly stunned. Yes, since the other party had defeated nearly 200,000 troops, why couldn't they take the initiative to attack? When Josiah received this news, she probably had the same feeling. But unlike the big shots, when she came back to her senses, her heart was filled with an uncontrollable, strong sense of confidence. This matter didn't need to be publicized at all. The people in the cities around the 100,000 mountains could easily notice that the atmosphere in the city was changing. First of all, the city gates had been open for a limited time, and the people were not allowed to go out. Then, the nobles dragged their families out of the city and moved towards the interior. Then, a large number of regular soldiers gathered at an extremely fast speed and dispersed to the various roads leading to the 100,000 mountains. These were the soldiers that the military division was preparing to support the front line. But now, They couldn't care less about this. They hurriedly transferred over to stop the Greycoat rebels from attacking the city. The Greycoat army is attacking. The people tasted the news, and, for a moment, they had mixed feelings. To sum it up, there was a sense of uneasiness brought about by the unreality of the situation, but also a sense of anticipation and excitement. The Greycoat army, led by Rosa, had been in the public eye for more than 10 years. The publicity work of Josiah's secret organization had also been paving the way for more than half a year in various cities. These are all very close to the people, but sometimes they also felt very far away. After all, their impression of the Greycoat army was based on hearsay. Even if they knew that there might be a Greycoat army propagandist around them, they had never seen them with their own eyes. Coupled with the continuous corruption of the official newspaper, it was inevitable for them to feel uneasy about guessing. As for expectations, that was simple. No matter what, over the years, the Greycoat army had given the people at the bottom a good impression. If the Greycoat army really did invade the city, they would be a part of it whether they were willing or not. Does that mean I don't have to pay taxes? Or does that mean I don't have to look at the faces of the nobles anymore? Of course, there are also people who firmly believed that the Greycoat army was the rioters mentioned in the newspapers. They claimed that once they entered the city, there might be uncontrollable chaos such as burning, killing, looting, and so on. However, no matter how complicated the thoughts of the people were, they couldn't leave the city like the nobles. They could only passively accept the results. The army was unstoppable. This was the most appropriate way to describe the army that the Greycoat army had sent out. Of course, this was the inevitable result. The checkpoints in Sherwan Mountain could only be used for reconnaissance. How could they count on a few hundred soldiers to fight against an army of tens of thousands? What a joke. When they first discovered the army, they began to flee in a hurry. Oh, they didn't flee. It was a strategic retreat. At least they brought back all kinds of information about the Greycoat army. Gradually, the information was quickly gathered and transmitted to the military in the north. ***. Where did they get so many people? In front of the tactical map, a big shot covered his head and roared. Now, on the map of the military in the north, the army that the Greycoat army had sent out was divided into about 6 to 7 groups. Each group had nearly 10,000 soldiers. This number was dumbfounding. One had to know that the last time the 3 major armies sent people to chase the Greycoat army, the other party only had about 20,000 people. Just this alone had shocked them greatly at that time. They had been greatly blamed by Ralph and the others. Moreover, although the Greycoat army had defeated nearly 200,000 regular soldiers before and after, that was in batches. In the eyes of the big shot, there was a large element of luck involved. Just like the last time, the other party had directly killed the commander with a cannon. How could they not win after that? But now, it was hard to say whether it was luck or not. At least, the Greycoat army should have 80,000 soldiers. 80,000. The few big shots looked at each other and sat back in their chairs powerlessly. This matter had blown up. It was not that the military in the north could not afford to send out soldiers of the same level. But what was the situation now? There was still a war at the front line. How could they throw 100,000 soldiers to start another war here? Needless to say, this matter could not be covered up. Someone from the capital would definitely come. Then, they would bring the punishment order for their inaction. If they walked on the mountain roads, it would take about 2 days to reach the city of Dawn from the surrounding cities. If the army moved, it would be much slower. It would take about twice the time. After the latest information was sent back, the checkpoints quickly retreated. The Greycoat army had split up and went to Barrack City. The Greycoat army had split up again. This time it was Stan's City. The Greycoat army had merged. All kinds of messy information were sent back to the rear. The soldiers who had rushed over could only move back and forth between the various cities. Just like how no one knew how many mountains there were in the 100,000 mountains, no one knew how many mountain roads there were. Winding and winding, thousands of turns. It only took a few hours for the Greycoat army to split up and merge again. However, the soldiers on the periphery might have to march for a day because of this. At this time, no matter how stupid the people in the military affairs department were, they knew that the Greycoat army was playing with them. Of course, while they were cursing, They had no choice but to take action. They had no choice. As long as one of them broke through the 100,000 mountains and captured the city, they would be in big trouble. On the fourth day, the soldiers on the two wings of the Gray Coat Army approached the center on the winding mountain roads. After pausing for half a day, an army of about 70 to 80,000 people was officially formed. Then, they no longer hesitated and approached the periphery. At this time, regardless of whether the Military Affairs Department wanted to fight or not, they could only brace themselves and send troops forward to fight. There was no choice. The defense force at the place where the Gray Coat Army went was not enough. If they could not stall for time, the point in front of them would be directly broken through. In the morning, 80 kilometers away from the nearest city, 5,000 brand regular soldiers against 80,000 Gray Coat Army soldiers defeated. In the afternoon, 70 kilometers away, 8,000 regular soldiers defeated. In the evening, 60 kilometers away, 15,000 regular soldiers had been defeated. Even the low-level students of the military academy knew that this kind of tactic was a taboo on the battlefield. But now, the big shots of the Military Affairs Department could only crazily gather the scattered soldiers while secretly swallowing this bitter fruit and adding this stupid decision to their resume. 3 battles, 3 victories. The next morning, 50 kilometers away, under the gaze of the 30,000 brand soldiers who had rushed over, the Gray Coat Army suddenly stopped. Then they began to cut down trees, move stones, and other things to build defensive fortifications. It was as if they were going to stay here permanently. The confrontation had officially begun. Chapter 412. What did they want to do? After the 80,000 troops of the Gray Coat Army stopped 50 kilometers away from the cities around the 100,000 mountains, everyone was baffled. The big shots of the Northern Military Armament Department were even more confused. After 3 battles and 3 victories, the other party's momentum was now at its peak. Whether they admitted it or not, the 30,000 regular soldiers who had rushed over could not stop them at all. After that, if the other party turned around a few more times, it was very likely that they would break through the defensive line that they were exhausted from running around. However, at this critical moment, the other party stopped to set up camp. However, they did not have the time to think about what conspiracy was inside. The big shots all heaved a long sigh of relief. No matter what, the other party's pause meant that they would not be able to enter the city for the time being. In this way, the pressure on the front line was undoubtedly much less. As they rejoiced over this result, they frantically mobilized their troops. It was not until almost 60,000 to 70,000 regular soldiers were mobilized that the burden in the hearts of the big shots was finally lifted. Among them, other than continuing to consolidate the defensive fortifications and sending out scouts to circle the battle line, the Gray Coat Army did not make any movements. The Gray Coat Army did not attack, so the regular soldiers naturally would not cause trouble. They did not even curse before the battle. They just obediently blocked the front. This result was inevitable. The Military Armament Department was not clear about the strange situation on the Gray Coat Army's side, but they all knew that the soldiers blocking the road were all frontline reserves. It would be best if it did not suffer any losses. Therefore, in this barren mountain, nearly 200,000 soldiers formed a strange standoff a few miles apart. Undercurrents were moving. In the afternoon, Stand City. Tang, what do Aunt Rosa and the others want to do? Putting down the latest information in his hand, Josiah frowned and asked the same question as the big shots of the Military Armament Department. Shaking his head, Tang pinched his chin. I don't know. There's too little information to analyze. Whether it was Tang or Josiah, they had both left the base for a period of time. During this time, because of the 3 encirclements, both sides were completely isolated and could not send any messages. As such, he naturally didn't know the inside story. Josiah was also aware of this, and the question was asked subconsciously. She then rested her chin on her hands and smiled. Haha, but no matter what, Tang, I feel that we're getting closer and closer to success this time. Tang didn't deny it. He nodded and sighed. Thank you for this excellent opportunity, or rather, thank the barbarian tribe. Huh. Yes, thanks to the savage tribe. Josiah stuck out his tongue and laughed. Everyone knew that if the savage tribes hadn't launched this rare large-scale attack, they wouldn't have been able to escape. The 80,000 men of the Gray Coat Army wouldn't have been taken seriously by the Bran Empire. Even if the military armament department couldn't handle it, tens of thousands of men from the three major corps at the front line could be transferred back. That would be enough to deal with the Gray Coat Army. After that, the two chatted for a while. In fact, it was mostly Josiah talking about how she looked forward to the situation when the Gray Coat Army broke into the city. Tang wasn't too interested. After a while, he put on a white-rimmed, four-cornered hat and prepared to go out. Which noble's party are you attending this time? Josiah was of noble birth. Naturally, she knew that this kind of attire was used for parties. The 10 people she sent over had been training with Tang for nearly a month. Now was the time to put it into practice. Baron Sheridan in the city got a new BMW, so he organized this party. Tang spread his hands. Of course, this is the reason on the surface. In fact, he's going to have a tryst with the wife of a rich businessman. You nobles like to do this kind of thing. Well, do you want to go? Forget it, I'm not going. Well, bring some desserts back. I haven't eaten them for a long time. I kind of miss the taste. Now, it was a special time. Josiah had a lot of things to deal with. Naturally, it was impossible for her to participate in such a boring party. It's not like I don't have money. My current identity is a foreign noble. In any case, I'm still a respectable person. Stealing desserts. Tang smoothed out his gorgeous robe, relaxed his body, and raised his head slightly. The corners of his mouth were slightly raised. After a few movements, Josiah's eyes lit up. Of course, she was familiar with this kind of elegant and intimate, but also a kind of arrogant and indifferent attitude of noble. However, this image collapsed when Tang spread his hands and revealed his usual mischievous smile. Well, it's quite interesting to do it once in a while. Well, wait for me. Watch me sweep the desserts on the table. He waved his hand generously and walked out of the house with ambitious steps. People who didn't know better would think that this noble was going to discuss a big business deal. Such a difference made Josiah behind him couldn't help but cover her mouth and chuckle. Passing through the hall in front of the house, Tang's footsteps slowed down. He narrowed his eyes and looked up at the bleak sun outside the gap in the eaves. He sighed softly. In fact, when he answered Josiah's question just now, Tang had a guess in his heart. However, in the end, he didn't say it out loud for some reason. Tang remembered that when he first joined, he heard Josiah talk about the Gray Coat Army's principles. The contents of these principles were quite practical and were especially beneficial to the lower-class civilians. However, after careful analysis, he found that these principles didn't touch on a key issue. For example, one of the principles was that civilians should participate in the political power. Whose political power was it? Of course, it was the Bran's. Therefore, the current actions of the Gray Coat Army were not difficult to understand. Rosa had led the Gray Coat Army for more than 10 years. She walked the path of rebellion. However, Tang could tell from her usual words and actions that Rosa had no intention of overthrowing the Bran Empire. Now that she had mobilized the army, she probably wanted to use this opportunity to force the Bran to negotiate and finally achieve the content of the previous principles. Tang had reservations about this point in his heart. He came from a modern world and had seen this kind of recruitment history. In the end, it didn't end well. Of course, it wasn't necessarily wrong to say that Rosa's decision was wrong. After all, the history of this world was different from that of the modern world. It was different to generalize. Moreover, the Bran Empire looked too big. Although the Gray Coat Army was developing well now, it was still incomparable to this behemoth. Normally, no one would think that the Gray Coat Army could compete. However, now that this behemoth had encountered a strong opponent, the Gray Coat Army took the opportunity to launch an attack. It was undoubtedly a good opportunity. No matter how one looked at it, Rosa's decision was correct. Phew! Shaking his head, Tang dispersed the thoughts in his mind. Whether it was right or wrong depended on the result. Moreover, this had nothing to do with him. Late at night, 100,000 Mountains, Gray Coat Army's temporary camp. In the central tent, candlelight flickered. Leader, this is a good opportunity for us. We can't let it go. Yes, we know it's a good opportunity. This is like asking a tiger for its skin. If it backfires, the consequences will be severe. Yes, understood. Leader, please think about it more. Okay, I'll think about it. Luo Xian sent the department heads out with a smile. However, their expressions were not as relaxed. Some of them wanted to say something, but stopped. Some of them were frowning. Some of them were worried. It was obvious that the conversation between the two sides was not very pleasant. However, Rose's authority in the Gray Coat Army was still very high. In the end, the few of them did not say anything. After a few sighs, they bowed and left. Watching the few of them leave, the smile on Rose's face slowly disappeared. He pursed his lips and looked up at the mountain breeze. Finally, he clenched his fist and turned around to lift the curtain. Leader, Rosa turned his head and saw Omeng in military attire walking quickly in the darkness. Old Marshal Omeng. Yes, come in and talk. Rosa lifted the curtain and walked in first. The tent was very simple. There was only a temporary table, a bench, and an oil lamp. Oh, there was also Zhou Fan in the corner. However, he did not have much of a presence. The moment Omeng entered the tent, he immediately bowed and said, Leader, the previous chaos has been investigated. It was a few drunk officers who got into an argument. Some of my soldiers joined in. Yes, they did not use their swords. Now they're all tied up. It was my incompetence. Please punish me. Old Marshal, you're too serious. It was just a small argument. There is no punishment. Rosa helped Omeng up and then asked casually, It was about whether to enter the city or not, right? Yes, yes. Omeng hesitated for a moment before answering. This again, it seems that I, as the leader, am standing against everyone this time. Shaking his head slightly, Rosa's face was a little gloomy. No, it is because they do not understand the leader's efforts. Old Marshal, have a seat. Rosa smiled bitterly and gestured with his hand. Then he sat back on the bench. After a moment of silence, Rosa said, Actually, they are not wrong. The battle at the front line is intense. If we attack, we should be able to take down a few cities. If the situation is good, we might be able to compete with Bran. But, Old Marshal Omeng, you were invited by me. Before we joined the Gray Coat Army, we had taken down a city. Omeng nodded. I have heard of this. Yes, everyone knows about it. The city was destroyed and the leader was killed. Only about 1,000 soldiers managed to escape. At that time, very few people mentioned the situation in the city. Most of the old people from that time have been sacrificed. I know that when we first entered the city, there were restrictions. The leader also said not to disturb the people. Therefore, the Gray Coat Army soldiers rushed into the houses of the nobles and rich merchants. They killed the original owners, stole the gold and silver, and abused the women. Unable to stop them, some of the leader's relatives and direct descendants also joined in. However, there were only so many things. Those with more power snatched more, and those with less power snatched less. Those ordinary soldiers and people had nothing, so they began to break into the houses of the city. At that time, they also killed some people who did whatever they wanted, but it was already too late. Moreover, it caused conflicts, and the soldiers began to fight among themselves. It was very tragic and chaotic. Actually, even if the army did not attack later, we were already on the verge of collapse. Perhaps this is the limitation of the civilians that Tang En mentioned before. It is not easy for the Gray Coat Army to be in its current situation. I don't know if the same situation will happen after our army enters. I don't dare to take the risk. To be honest, I don't know if the decision to ask a tiger for its skin is the right one. Old Marshal, I don't want to repeat the same mistake. Omeng was silent for a moment. Then he stood up and saluted. Don't worry, leader. No matter what decision you make, the army and I will always be on your side. This was an extremely important promise. Omeng also had the qualifications to make such a promise. Among the soldiers of the Gray Coat Army, this old marshal had an important position. Rosa was not surprised. He nodded slightly, then shrugged and smiled. My decision may not be the right one. Haha, if only Tangan was here. He can always see further than me. Omeng smiled and nodded. Huh, that kid has some strange ideas. Well, the previous few divisions, and with the help of the gray space, the messenger should have rushed out. Next, I hope he and Josiah can settle the matter well. The two of them, well, no problem. Chapter 413. No matter how stormy the outside world was, as long as life continued, the days that should be lived would still be lived. After confirming that the Gray Coat Army had no intention of charging into the city for the time being, although the city gates of the cities around the 100,000 mountains were still closed for a limited time, the lives of the people had gradually returned to normal. The only difference was that there was more to talk about with wine. As for the nobles, when the news had just spread, many of them had left with their families. However, there were always some who did not choose to leave the city for various reasons. Therefore, some gatherings were inevitable. Think about it. If they still held a gathering calmly at this time, how calm and elegant would it be if word got out? It was in such an environment that Tang brought his 10 swindler apprentices to fake various identities and roamed among the upper-class gatherings. Generally speaking, the nobles were still very well informed. Therefore, Tang Yin's request for these people was to collect as much information about the Gray Coat Army as possible after they had adapted to their various identities and temperaments. It had to be said that the results were remarkable. In comparison, Josiah's secret organization was much inferior. Of course, this was inevitable. After all, the various cities now restricted the flow of people, so Josiah naturally received much less information. In the evening, in the attic where the secret organization was located, Tang brought the 10 or so people back to eat and drink to their heart's content. Matt, you've improved a lot in your treatment of people recently. Not bad. However, you still have to pay attention to your image. Who the hell would pick up a large plate of beef and start eating in noble gathering? You're a rich businessman, not a hungry dog. I was hungry when I was young. I can't stand the sight of meat. And I don't know what happened today, but the dessert on the table disappeared in a short while. Captain, I'll definitely change next time. Ahem, it's good that you know. And you, Cliff, don't just laugh at others. That madam already stretched out her arm. Why didn't you kiss her hand immediately? Captain, I'm just not used to it yet. The skin on that old lady's hand was loose, and she was smeared with so much powder. She looked like rotten and moldy cheese. I was scared when I saw her. Ha! While talking and laughing, Tang Yin patted his forehead and walked into the attic. The dozen or so people followed behind, laughing and mocking each other. Looking at Tang Yin's back, their eyes were filled with undisguised worship. This admiration came from his own astonishing changes, as well as the sense of accomplishment from receiving valuable information from time to time. After training for nearly a month, everyone was familiar with each other. Even though they were still in awe of Tang Yin in the beginning, the dozen or so people gradually let go of the burden in their hearts and joked occasionally. Although Tang Yin didn't let them call him boss or instructor, he directly said that it was because they were too stupid and couldn't afford to lose face. But in their eyes, Tang Yin, an extremely legendary figure, was undoubtedly their instructor. As soon as he entered, Tang Yin saw Josiah running toward him. He waved his hand and said, "That's all for today. You can leave now." When the dozen or so people heard this, their faces became serious. They bowed and saluted, then dispersed. With a flip of his hands, Tang Yin took out a bag full of desserts from under his gorgeous robe and greeted them. It's just some desserts. You don't have to be in such a hurry. Tang, Aunt Luosha sent a letter. At Pullen Port, along the road where Tang Yin chased after Sessman, a group of obviously distinguished people were about to walk down from the luxurious ship. Is this the Pullen city that is said to separate the north and south of Bran? It doesn't look like much. An old man in luxurious clothes stood at the side of the ship, glancing at the port, and said rather reservedly. The old man next to him shook his head and smiled. Sir Simpson, there's only one capital city. In terms of prosperity, this place naturally can't be compared to the capital city. But here, The north and south converge. The scenery and buildings are mixed together. If you think about it carefully, there's still a different flavor. Oh, then we'll have to take a good look. Hee hee. I hope it's just as Sir Ronald said. After you. The Sir called Simpson turned slightly to the side and waved at the trestle connecting the shore. Sir, please go first. Sir Ronald was also very polite. Ha, then I'll. After laughing twice, Simpson was no longer polite. He simply saluted and was about to step onto the trestle. However, at this moment, a black shadow suddenly rushed out from behind, squeezed past Simpson, and stepped onto the trestle. As he walked down, he turned his head and said, "You two old fellows, you've been nagging non-stop the whole way. Now that we're getting off the ship, you still don't stop nagging. I really can't stand you two." Although it was evening, the port was illuminated. The person walking on the trestle was a middle-aged man with a majestic physique. Coupled with the words, "Your mother," that kept coming out of his mouth, he looked like a boor. However, if one looked at the way he nonchalantly squeezed past the two nobles and the expensive clothes on his body, he was undoubtedly a great noble. Sure enough, although the two old nobles who were insulted were livid and muttered words like "stupid pig" and "damn it," in the end, they didn't wave their hands to order the guards to kill this person. In addition to the guards and servants, there were many people with extraordinary identities behind the two old nobles. However, they didn't have the bandit aura of the person just now. They all pretended not to see anything and looked at the port. Although there was some unpleasantness, they still had to get off the ship. With such a group of people gathered together, there was naturally someone in Springfield City to receive them. Under the trestle, the mayor of Springfield City led a group of local nobles and bowed to welcome them. Because he didn't see the situation just now, the enthusiastic mayor was rebuffed by Simpson and Sir Ronald. His words and actions immediately became more cautious. From this point of view, this group of people from the capital did indeed have a great background. After the mayor carefully greeted them, he pointed to the carriage not far behind him and said, "Sirs, you must be tired from the journey. Now that it's late, why don't you rest in the city first?" Regardless of whether their identities were the highest, Simpson and Ronald were the oldest people in the group. This kind of matter naturally had to be handled by them. However, just as they were about to speak, the majestic middle-aged man from before looked around and said as if there was no one else around, "Strange, where did that kid Philip go?" Simpson and Ronald's faces darkened again, but when they heard that, they still swept a glance at the crowd behind them and asked in a low voice, "Philip, Philip." As a group of nobles, when it came to the differences between the North and the South, their words and actions had to be elegant. However, this majestic man didn't care about that and shouted with a rough voice. His loud voice reverberated throughout the harbor, causing Simpson and the other two men to roll their eyes. Coming. After a series of responses, a figure appeared on the bow of the ship. While tidying up his clothes, he walked down the trestle. He had the appearance of a young man with a handsome face. His clothes were a little disheveled, as if he had just been entangled with someone. In addition, there was a red lipstick mark at the corner of his mouth that hadn't been wiped clean. Well, this was the friend that Tang In and the others had made during the negotiation, the wolf of the imperial capital, Philip. These two. Simpson looked at Philip, then at the majestic middle-aged man beside him, and the corner of his mouth twitched as if he had a toothache. "Ha, Philip, where's your woman?" The majestic middle-aged man seemed to be quite familiar with Philip, and he asked with an arm around his shoulder. Philip wiped the red lipstick from the corner of his mouth and replied indifferently, "She went back with the ship. Our fate has come to an end." "Ha, that's a well-tested reason." The majestic middle-aged man shook his head and laughed, as if he knew about Philip's situation. Since everyone had gathered here, the next step was naturally to rest at the place that the mayor had arranged. However, the majestic middle-aged man had another problem. He waved his hand at the mayor and said, "No need, just tell us the address." "Oh, right, give us the address too. Which city has the most beautiful women? Don't say you don't know what I mean." He paused for a moment, and under the mayor's dumbfounded gaze, he stretched his muscles and bones. "Damn it, I didn't want to use the teleportation array and had to take the ship. I've been bored to death these days. What are you still standing there for? Hurry up and tell us the address. Right, who else wants to go? I'll treat you. Awkward silence. Simpson and the others knew this guy's style, so they were not surprised. They put on an expressionless face, as if they did not know this person. However, the nobles who came to receive them were a little dumbfounded. What was going on? This person from the capital? He was indeed bold and unrestrained. And no one is going? Philip, you're not going either? Philip scratched his head and spread his hands. I'm not interested in that. Oh, I understand. You like to seduce the ladies of good families. The majestic middle-aged man patted his head and looked around. Seeing that no one responded, he waved his hand disinterestedly. Forget it. It's really boring to come out with you. Each and every one of you is either too old or too pretentious. He muttered the last few words in a low voice, but it was enough for everyone to hear. After the shock, the nobles lowered their heads and pretended not to hear. Although the rest of the people accompanying them were also angry, they did not lower themselves to the same level as him. However, the two old men, Simpson and Ronald, could not take it anymore. They had already been provoked, and now they were being told that they were too old. Alex, watch your words and actions. Look at you. Where are the manners of a noble? Simpson shouted angrily. Nobles, no matter how angry they were, would generally not do something as disgraceful as insulting to someone's face. Relatively speaking, this kind of questioning that the other party did not have the manners of a noble was already a very heavy insult. However, the majestic middle-aged man called Alex did not care at all. He curled his lips. What's wrong with me? I'm just speaking the truth. Tell me, can you still do it or not? If you can, let's compete. You will die in the hands of a woman sooner or later. It's a curse. You want to die like this, but it's a pity that you can't do it anymore. Yeah. Ugh. Sir Simpson, hurry up and get a doctor. Go to the church, it's near here. As Simpson suddenly fell to the ground, the harbor immediately turned into a mess. In the midst of the chaos, Alex took 2 steps back speechlessly and spread his hands. This trick again, pretending to faint when you can't win. Hey, everyone saw it. I didn't hit him. If anything happens, don't come looking for me. Chapter 414. Philip? So, Leader Rosa wants us to negotiate with the new nobles? Location, Mountain Creek City. As expected. After reading the letter from top to bottom, Twain nodded and sighed thoughtfully. Previously, during the first extortion negotiation, Tang and Philip had become good friends with each other. At that time, Philip did not hide his intentions. So, Tang knew that Philip's visit was not just for fun, but also to test the strength of the Grey Coat Army on behalf of the new nobles to see if there was any possibility of cooperation. Of course, the latter was just in passing. After all, the new nobles were still nobles. They still did not have a good impression of the Grey Coat Army. However, perhaps because they wanted to have more power, they still let the unreliable Philip take a look. It was a foreshadowing. However, the development of the Grey Coat Army was completely beyond everyone's expectations. First, there was a huge publicity campaign. Then there was the construction of a city. And then there was the 3 consecutive defeats of nearly 200,000 Bran soldiers, causing a sensation in the entire Bran Empire. So, the new nobles naturally turned their attention to them. Moreover, because the situation at the front line was fierce, no one wanted to start a war with the Grey Coat Army. So, the new nobles had some room to maneuver. Also, these are the conditions of the negotiation. There are notes on it. Some must be agreed, and some could be discussed. Josiah handed over a thick stack of paper again and said, Aunt Rosa told us not to have any psychological burden. It would be best if we can negotiate, but if not, then so be it. In short, don't let yourself be wronged and don't lose out. Tangan took it and roughly browsed through it. He nodded slightly. The conditions mentioned were actually the contents of the Grey Coat Army's mission. For example, the civilians should have their own land, reduce unnecessary taxes, and the children of the civilians should be the same as the children of the nobles and have the right to study in the academy. It still came to this step. Tang and felt a little complicated. He did not know whether Rosa's decision was right or wrong. Now, he could only wait and see. Putting down the letter, he looked up and asked, "So what do you think?" "Thoughts? You mean Auntie Rosa's decision?" Josiah was slightly surprised, but he immediately reacted and pursed his lips. "Well, I don't have any thoughts. I just feel that it's a pity that we didn't fight our way into the city this time. It's also a bit dangerous to cooperate with the new nobles." But Aunt Luosa must have considered many aspects before making this decision. "I'll listen to her. Yeah, everyone knows that this is dangerous. High risk, high reward. Who knows? Well, let's do it then," Tang said affirmatively as he thumped his palms, threw away the distracting thoughts in his mind. The Gray Coat Army was led by Rosa, so she had the right to decide the direction of the army. In any case, Tang did not have much to do with it. He just had to do as he was told. "And where's the messenger?" "He's overworked and injured. I've already arranged for him to rest," Josiah replied. Then, as if he had thought of something, he rubbed his palm and picked up a sealed paper bag from behind him and handed it over. "Right, he asked me to pass this to you. It seems to be from David and the others." The message delivered this time was extremely important, and the Gray Space's position in the Gray Coat Army was a bit vague, giving people a feeling that they were neither close nor distant. So even if they knew that if David and the others were to do it, the chances would be higher, the ministers still unanimously decided to arrange for someone else to deliver the letter. Tang nodded and took it and put it on the table. The Gray Space team was not like the 10 professional swindlers they were currently training, especially David, Michaud, and the first batch of members. They were all trained by Tang Yin. To some extent, they were a weaker version of Tang Yin. Of course, everyone had their own specialties. Similar to the work of collecting intelligence, everyone was involved. At first, it was to investigate the cause of Bull's death. Later, it was to investigate the Bosco family. In the end, because the Bosco family's business in the Gray Coat Army was too big, the entire station was included in the scope of intelligence collection. When Tang An was in the station, he and Michaud were responsible for analyzing and collating this information. Later, when he left the station, he gave this authority to another person and Michaud. The thick paper bag in front of them was undoubtedly the information about the current situation of the Gray Coat Army. Because they had to rush to Mountain Stream City recently, the matters here were naturally dealt with first. Therefore, Tang Yin and Josiah did not talk much. After chatting about Rosa's decision, the two of them went back to their respective rooms. While opening the paper bag, he walked into the room, lit the oil lamp, and took out 2 large stacks of organized information. After flipping through them slightly, Tang Yin could not help but touch his nose awkwardly. At that time, he had left in a hurry and did not tell Michaud the news of the other person. So the 2 pieces of information he received now were somewhat similar in content. Tang Yin first picked up Michaud's piece of information and flipped through it. After a moment, he frowned thoughtfully. There were useful and useless pieces of information. Michaud was meticulous, so naturally, he had sorted out the important pieces and handed them over. It talked about the development and changes of the Gray Coat Army after he left, and it highlighted the Bosco family. There was nothing much to say about the former. It was developing at a high speed according to the plan track. However, the latter had changed a lot. With the gradual improvement of the City of Dawn, the power of the Bosco family was also expanding rapidly, especially Bosco, who had now become the 3rd person under Rosa and Omen. He's really scheming and astute. Seeing that this old guy was so proud of himself, Tang Yin was naturally a little unhappy. However, after thinking about it, this was a normal result. With the gradual increase of personnel and the establishment of the station, the Gray Coat Army was becoming more and more standardized. The Gray Coat Army was becoming more and more standardized. In the past, it only required a few ministers to make a decision. Now, due to the large implications, they had no choice but to set up their own departments. In this way, they naturally needed professional talents. Most of the people in the Gray Coat Army were commoners, and even a few of the higher-ups were only literate. Naturally, they were not capable of doing so. At this time, the advantage of the Bosco family was also shown. Don't forget that when they were besieged by the Bran Empire, they had brought their entire family to join the Greycoat army. As long as they were nobles, even if they were not successful, they would have received basic education in the academy. In this way, it was naturally much easier for them to deal with things than for commoners who were illiterate. In this way, the Bosco family would naturally obtain their current status. At that time, the base plan was proposed by Borg under the instructions of Bosco. It could be seen that such a result was already within Bosco's expectations. This was not considered a conspiracy, but an open and above-board scheme. After all, the Greycoat army had to take this path eventually. Bosco just wanted to make it happen faster. This was equivalent to quietly planning for the future. Tangen could not help but praise Bosco's scheming. After thinking for a few seconds, Tang smacked his lips and flipped to the last few pages. Against such an enemy, it would be more reassuring to kill him. The last few pages talked about what happened after the army left Dawn City. Tangen took a few glances and frowned again. Rose's authority in the Greycoat army was indisputable. There was no other person who could match her. However, her decision to accept the negotiation with the new nobles this time could not possibly be approved by everyone. Perhaps it was because she knew this that she only officially announced this matter after she led the army out. At that time, there was an uproar. Even most of the ministers raised objections and complained in private. In the army, there were also some radical officers who were very dissatisfied. However, this time, Rosa showed an extremely tough side. She led the army out and suddenly decided to stop 50 kilometers away, directly shutting the mouths of the opponents. There was no doubt that this was a gamble. If a negotiation did not succeed, Rosa would have to bear the crime of hindering the battle. Moreover, even if a negotiation succeeded, once the Bran came to settle the score, Rosa's authority in the Greycoat army would not be the same as before. Even so, in the previous letter, Rosa still comforted the two of them, saying that they should not feel burdened. It would be best if the negotiation succeeded, but if not, it was fine. What a magnanimous person. What a bold person. After sighing with emotion, Tang crossed his fingers and could not help but shake his head slightly. It seemed that this negotiation could only succeed. He exhaled slightly and flipped to the last page of the information. This page was not information, but a suggestion that Misho was prepared to implement. He suggested that the gray space recruit again and fill up the quota. The gray space was now a regimental identity in the Greycoat army. According to what Rosa had promised before, there were 200 people in the Greycoat army. Tangen did not object to Misho's approach of acting first and reporting later. The Greycoat army was getting bigger and bigger, and the gray space naturally had to expand as well. Otherwise, it would be very difficult to do things. Moreover, the gray space's system had been perfected, and he did not need to do things like training himself. Therefore, Tang acquiesced to Misho's suggestion. Then he felt a faint sense of accomplishment as he felt that the team he had cultivated was on the right track. He picked up another piece of information. This was handed over by the person who Tang entrusted the authority to. In his heart, Tang also intended to give this authority to him. However, after all, he had only taken over for a short time, so the information he made seemed a little scattered. There was no change in the important content, but the summary was not as comprehensive as Misho's, and Tang needed to rework it in his heart. However, the small matter he mentioned caught Tang's attention. This was about some of the recent changes in Misho's behavior, his cruel means to the bandits, and a small conflict with David outside the city. The person who Tang handed over the authority to was also a member of the Gray Space, but the current situation was a bit special. He had a good relationship with David, Misho, and the others, so the things he said were completely true. For example, after the conflict, David and Misho quickly reconciled and went to the tavern to drink all night. However, it was precisely because of this that Tang had some doubts in his heart. Logically speaking, if it was just an ordinary quarrel, Based on his relationship with David and Michaud, it shouldn't have been written down. After pondering for a moment, Tang In read the information again and finally fixed his eyes on the way Michaud treated the bandits. He nodded with some understanding. Michaud had always wanted to take revenge, and Tang In knew that this was one of the fundamental driving forces for his rapid improvement in strength. Michaud should be angry with the other bandits, so his means were a little cruel, which caused David and the others to feel uncomfortable. Thinking that he had thought it through, Tang In did not care much anymore. What's wrong with hatred? He also had hatred, but he didn't do anything. Chapter 4:15. Although they had received such an important mission, there were still some things to take care of here. Even the leisurely Tang and had to explain to his 10 swindler apprentices. Josiah was even more so, with many chores to deal with. However, thinking of the slow and sluggish efficiency of the aristocrats, Tang In was not in a hurry. He waited for 2 days before leaving when the city gates opened. At this time, it was difficult for civilians to leave the city, but Tang In was now considered a top figure in the aristocratic circle of Stan City. He just had to say hello and naturally let them go easily. There were even a few small aristocrats who wanted to hold a farewell party for him, but he politely declined. Stan City was not far from Riva City, so the road to Mountain Creek City was similar. Now that he was going through this journey again, Tang In's heart was filled with emotions. He was interested and pointed to a few places and said, "Hey, do you see that? I turned here once, but I almost couldn't get out of the forest. Do you see that fork in the road? Damn it, the separated roads are actually a loop." Fortunately, Oliver and the others don't know, or I would be dead. Now that he thought about it, Tang In's tone was naturally relaxed. After all, he was riding a horse all night, but now he was driving a carriage with a beauty. However, Josiah and the others who knew the inside story naturally knew the danger. If they took a wrong turn, they would end up in a bottomless abyss. At that time, Tang In fled from Fire Beacon City to Riva City for 5 days. Although there were many twists and turns along the way, this time was not something that could be achieved by leisurely driving a carriage. In fact, after 5 days, they had only covered half of the journey. The journey was always boring, especially now that there was no pressure at all. Even if there were bandits who occasionally jumped out before Tang and could teach them a lesson, Josiah would reach out and grab a cold ice prism out of thin air, and the bandits would immediately retreat respectfully to the side of the road, almost kneeling to send them off. How boring. While Tang In and the rest were hurrying on with their journey out of boredom, Philip and the rest were also making their way towards Mountain Creek City. Tang In was right. The way the nobles did things was really sluggish. In fact, the distance between the two parties in Mountain Stream City was about the same. However, Philip and the others had set off 2 days earlier, so they were still a little behind Tang In and the others. Of course, there was a reason for this. After all, whether it was their carriage or their horses, they were much better than Tang In's ordinary carriage. But every day, they calculated the distance and hurried to make sure that every day they would set off comfortably from the city, then receive a grand welcome in the next city, and then settle down to rest. Even if they arrived at the city just after noon, they would not set off again. In this way, there was no need to talk about efficiency in the afternoon on the wide official road. Philip's luxurious carriage was traveling at a moderate speed, surrounded by hundreds of spirited cavalrymen. Their eagle-like eyes scanned the surrounding barren hills to ensure the safety of the group. In front of these knights who were armed to the teeth, there were 4 people in plain clothes who stood out. The 2 people in the lead were wearing luxurious robes. They were Alex and Philip. Alex was in high spirits as he curiously looked at the surrounding barren hills. He seemed to be feeling a kind of unseen heroism or something. From time to time, he would yell out a few times. Philip was in low spirits as he sat on the horse, his body swaying back and forth as if he was taking a nap. As for the 2 people behind him, one was strong and the other was thin. They should be Alex's butler and bodyguards. Haha, the scenery in the north is indeed different from the capital. This mountain, this sky, this is just like prostitutes. The prostitutes in the capital are wrapped up tightly. Even when they go to bed, they're still polite and say a few vulgar words. But the prostitutes in the north that I've seen in the past few days, they talk about the price as soon as they open their mouths. Once they reach an agreement, they immediately take off their clothes and go straight to the point. It really makes people feel good and refreshed. Philip, you are experienced and knowledgeable. Don't you think so? Philip. After sighing with emotion, Alex realized that the person he was talking to had already entered a drowsy state. He hurriedly reached out and shook Philip a few times to wake him up. What's the situation? Philip, who was struggling to open his eyes, was almost shaken off the horse. After regaining his senses, he hastily grabbed the reins and climbed back onto the horse with great difficulty. He had a baffled expression on his face. Alex helplessly rubbed his forehead. He couldn't bear to look at Philip's miserable appearance. I don't want to say this, Philip, but your mighty grandfather can be said to be the best in the world. Although your father isn't good at martial arts, he is still the pillar of the country. But why you look so weak? I'm very strong, okay? The thousands of women in the capital can prove this point. Philip stretched his arms and flexed his muscles, trying his best to make a strong posture. Immediately after, he lowered his body and spread out his hands. Besides, don't compare me with those two perverts. It's not like you don't know that I've already severed all ties with my family. Actually, from a certain point of view, I am also the best in the world. Haha. Speechless, Alex shook his head and curled his lips. That's right. When it comes to picking up girls, you should be the best in the world. You flatter me. Hearing this, Philip immediately became spirited. However, in an instant, he seemed to have thought of something. He hesitantly scratched his head. Actually, I can't be considered the best in the world. It's because there's a woman that I can't take down. Oh, there's such a woman? Then I really want to see it for myself. Ares was truly astonished. He himself came from the capital city, so he naturally knew of Philip's capabilities. It wasn't an exaggeration to say that as long as he made a move, he would definitely not return empty-handed. One could say that Philip relied on his looks, his background, and so on. However, one couldn't deny his achievements. Furthermore, looks were something that one was born with. It was impossible to use disfigurement to prove this point. As for his background and so on, ever since he had severed all ties with his family, Philip had been penniless for a period of time. However, this completely didn't stop him from living a carefree life of picking up girls. Furthermore, there were many people in the capital who were richer than him. However, who had ever seen someone who had reached such a high level? I should be able to meet her this time. Who knows? Sigh, please, God of light. Seeing that I didn't pick up, I didn't pick up too many nuns, please let me meet her again. Josiah's hands made the sign of the Temple of Light in front of his chest as he prayed with a devout expression. This time, negotiation? Could it be that she's from the Gray Coat Army? Alex's reaction was quick. He was surprised at first, and then he looked excited. Philip looked at him in shock. Yes. What's with that expression of yours? Cough. After coughing twice, Alex looked around with a mysterious expression. He then leaned closer and whispered excitedly, Tell me, is it that person called Rosa? You're pretty good, kid. Doesn't that mean that the negotiation between the new nobles this time is in the bag? Damn. Philip's whole body trembled. He pushed Alex away and said helplessly, Although love is something that doesn't matter if it's poor, beautiful, or ugly, we still have to consider the age gap. Is that so? That's really a pity. Well, actually, you can consider bringing her along. At least you can win this negotiation. Philip quickly shook his head. Are you kidding me? I'm a good young man. I don't want to die young. Oh, could it be that she's taken? Whether she's taken or not, she can't be touched. Well, don't ask me why. It involves my grandfather, so I can't go into too much detail. No way, is it that serious? These two idiots. Just as Alex and Philip were talking about something, the curtain of the luxurious carriage behind them was lifted, revealing Simpson's old and angry face. He then let out a cold snort and put down the curtain. He turned his head and said, Sir Ronald, it's fine if that womanizer Philip comes along. After all, he's also a member of the new nobles. But what's up with that idiot Alex? Could it be that he's also one of your people? He said that he came to the north to supervise the family business. Shaking his head, Ronald smiled bitterly. Sir, there's no need to test him anymore. I can tell you very clearly that Alex is not on our side. In fact, when we first set off from the capital, I always thought that he was on your side. At this point, Simpson nodded and did not question further. That was not to say that he trusted Sir Ronald. In fact, if he were to analyze their conversation carefully, he would find that although they were in the same car and were very polite in their words, they were clearly two different passers-by. Therefore, Simpson could only believe in his own judgment and the fact that Alex's family had always stood on the side of not helping either side. There is no doubt that Alex was a headache for both of them, so they immediately changed the topic after a few words. Simpson narrowed his eyes and drooped his eyelids. The new nobles are developing rapidly. I'm sure that you're aiming for something big in this negotiation, sir. I'm just passing on a message for someone else. I don't have any ulterior motives. Besides, don't I have you guys to supervise me? Since they were strangers, how could Ronald tell him the truth? He kept a low profile and retracted his words. Simpson was naturally not easily fooled. He chuckled and said, "What are you talking about, sir? We're just following orders to take a look. There's no such thing as supervision. Besides, it's easy to supervise the negotiations on the surface, but it's hard to say what's going on in secret." Ronald spread his hands and said calmly, "Then, sir, you might as well open your eyes wider and see if we have any secret deals. I'll open my eyes when it's time." Don't blame me for not reminding you. You're holding a double-edged sword now." Simpson exhaled through his nostrils, and there was a glimmer in his small eyes. The Gray Coat Army is a gang of rebels and bandits. They're insatiable. You won't be able to satisfy their appetite. When that time comes, be careful not to hurt yourself. Thank you for reminding me, sir. But as you said just now, since it's a double-edged sword, it's naturally impossible to only hurt yourself. Please." Ronald picked up a cup of green tea and waved his hand. The corners of his mouth curled up into a smile. "So, you guys have to be careful too." All right, I'll wait and see. Please." Then I'll wait and see." Chapter 416. In the morning, the north gate of Mountain Stream City was crowded with people and carriages. "Stop! Open the door." 2 people, 20 copper coins. "Well, thank you for your hard work. This is the entrance fee. Go in." "Thank you." Before the outcome of this negotiation was reached, it would not be publicly announced. The Gray Coat Army was still confronting the Brand's regular army in the mountains, so the atmosphere in the north was still tense. However, Mountain Stream City was still quite a distance away, so there weren't any signs of turmoil and chaos. After a simple process, Tang Un's ordinary carriage finally drove into the familiar city after more than 10 days of travel. "We're finally here again. Well, I don't know if the statue in the city has been repaired. Let's go take a look later, haha." Tang In pulled the reins to lead the carriage into the main road as he laughed without turning his head. "It's impossible to repair it after you destroyed it like that." "Well, a new one was built this time. I heard that a sculptor was especially invited from the capital." As the head of the Gray Coat Army's secret service, Josiah naturally knew about this news. Tang In raised his eyebrows. "Oh, then I really have to go and admire it." Tang, don't mess around." The Temple of Light took over the defense of the statue this time. "What do you mean?" Tang In touched his nose and smiled helplessly. "I'm not the reincarnation of the god of destruction. How can I destroy a statue whenever I see one? Besides, there are 2 acquaintances here. Well, it's best not to interact with them." "That's good." Josiah secretly breathed a sigh of relief. He could not blame her for being so sensitive. There were already several statues in the city that had been destroyed by Tang In. "By the way, the 2 acquaintances you mentioned just now, are they Bose and Bugnis?" "Yes." Tang In nodded, and his face was a little emotional. "I really don't know how to say it. It's fate. It's really King fate. I can't help but bump into these 2 jinxes everywhere. You must be like this in their hearts as well." Josiah covered his mouth and laughed. Then, He tilted his head as if he had remembered something. He pursed his lips and said, "Tang, actually, Bose and the others. Well, I received news some time ago that the military armament department asked Bose to be in charge of searching for the personnel of the secret agencies in various cities, but he faked his injury and avoided it. Not only that, but when the guards of every city were on the move, only Mountain Stream City remained silent. Tang, perhaps between the two of you, there is no possibility of reconciliation." Waving his hand to interrupt Josiah, Tang pinched his chin. "You don't know Bose well enough. The reason why he didn't attack the Gray Coat Army was because he wasn't interested. However, he's very interested in assassins and bounty hunters, so he won't let me go. But there's no need to worry, because he can't do anything to me now." It was often said that the person who understood a person the most was not a friend, but an opponent. There was no doubt about Bose's ability. Tang admitted this. Otherwise, he wouldn't have chosen Revis City as his last resort when he was on the run. Similarly, Bose was able to cooperate with Tang after listening to the assassin's words. He understood Tang quite well. It could be said that if Bose really wanted to attack the secret agencies, Josiah and the others would not have an easy time now. But because of this understanding, Tang had already concluded that Bose would not be interested in this aspect. As for himself, to be honest, Tang was really not worried about Bose doing anything to him. He was not saying Pooh or Oliver. He knew Bose well enough and was vigilant against him. How could he fall into his opponent's trap? As long as he didn't fall into the trap, with Tang's ability, Bose couldn't do anything to him. Josiah was just casually making a suggestion. After listening to Tang's analysis, he naturally wouldn't continue to persuade him. After chatting for a while, the carriage finally arrived at the city square. As expected, a white jade statue stood in the center of the square, taller than the previous one. The image didn't change. It still looked like a goddess holding a vase. This was for sure. After all, this statue was not only the saintess of the Temple of Light, but also the goddess of Mountain Stream City for hundreds of years. It was indeed the work of a master. Tang squinted his long and narrow eyes, secretly praising it. Although the statue's image didn't change, with Tang's keen observation, he could naturally see a kind of ingenuity in the details. Tang's eyes suddenly opened. He clearly saw a very fine ray of white light flash on the statue, quickly passing by. "This statue has magic waves," Josiah at the side murmured at the right time, hesitantly guessing. "It should have a protective and warning function. This way, if the statue is attacked, the people of the church can quickly rush over." Tang nodded. This was like the light god pendant that he killed Sessman last time, but the one in front of him was bigger. He shrugged, the corner of his mouth twitching slightly. They're really willing to put in a lot of effort. Josiah couldn't help but laugh after hearing these ambiguous words of jealousy. Yes, to prevent people like you who have ulterior motives. Uffed, Tang laughed, then turned his head and drove the carriage through the square, whispering to himself, "Who cares about this broken statue? Isn't it better to kill people?" After passing the central square, the traffic gradually decreased, and the carriage gradually sped up towards the secret organization of Mountain Stream City, the Riverside Tavern. With the investment of Tang's funds, the secret organization's life was now much better. The branches in each city moved out of the original slums and set up their own businesses, whether small or large. Although they had not turned their losses into profits, everything seemed to be on the right track. Mountain Stream City, as one of the original headquarters of the secret organization, originally had a tavern to make a living, but now there were no changes, because they had suddenly received the news beforehand, at the long table near the tavern door. Enoch and a few other high-ranking members of the secret organization who had welcomed Tang and were waiting here. The situation changes too quickly. It's really unexpected. Our Gray Coat Army actually has a time when Brand voluntarily lowered his head to negotiate. If those old brothers of mine were still here, the words were rather emotional. An old man with a white beard at the table shook his head slightly and drank the ale in his cup in one gulp. "Elder Ba, don't be too sad. This is always good news. Your old brothers must also want to see this scene. Dave comforted at the side. And yes, it's always good news. This old man was one of the high-ranking members of the secret organization. Most people called him Elder Ba, and he was also an old man in the Gray Coat Army. He used to be an excellent scout in the army and competed with the Brand soldiers for many years. Now he had joined Josiah's organization. Perhaps only such a person would be able to understand the many emotions contained in this news. Seeing that the atmosphere was a bit gloomy, another young man laughed and said, "Actually, I think the army should take down a few cities. When the time comes for negotiations, their backs will be stronger." Ha! A few people laughed in agreement. Dave also laughed and said, "It's not that easy. Once we break into the city, there's no turning back. You may not know this, but I was with the commander a few days ago. When our army was approaching the outside world, Brand mobilized 100,000 soldiers to stop us in just a few days. If it wasn't for the fierce battle at the front line, TSK, in short, we can't underestimate them. Yes, that's the reason. Let the leaders worry about these things. We still have to do the negotiations at hand." In the morning, the tavern was the most gloomy. Since there were no outsiders here, they didn't need to hide their conversation. However, in these lively discussions, Enoch, who was sitting opposite Elder Ba, didn't participate. His expression was calm, and no one could tell if he was happy or angry. His attention wasn't on these topics. "All right, Dave. Now that the commander is back, Captain Tang should be coming with him, right?" Enoch's ears twitched, and his eyes became unusually sharp in an instant. However, he reacted quickly and returned to his calm state without anyone noticing. He tilted his head slightly and looked at Dave. Dave nodded and showed a hint of bitterness. "Of course he's coming." "Oh." A few young men at the table showed a hint of resentment at the same time. After they looked at each other, they quickly covered it up with embarrassment. Seeing their expressions, Fu sighed inwardly. Of course, he knew what they were thinking. He was the same before. However, he rushed to Riva's city with Josiah. He knew what kind of emotional state Josiah was in after Tang and was injured. It was clearly beyond the boundary of friends. Therefore, after leaving, Dave wisely dispelled this thought, so as not to add to the sadness in the future. Elder Ba didn't feel the complicated emotions of a younger generation. He stroked his white beard and praised, "This Captain Tang is really amazing. 2 Earth Stage warriors and a great mage. To tell you the truth, I thought that this would be the end of my life." However, he first killed Eunice in the city and solved the organization's siege. Then, he ran for nearly 1,000 miles, passed through several cities, and finally turned the tables. Phew! Awesome, he's a hero. Come, let's have a toast for this. There was a momentary pause, and then a few wine glasses were raised and clinked. Elder Ba is right. This battle was really shocking. It's funny that the believers of the Temple of Light were so complacent. They didn't expect the hero to be our Gray Coat Army. Ha! Come cheers! No matter what kind of subtle thoughts they had about Tang Yin, they couldn't help but praise this heaven-defying battle result. Of course, this didn't include Enoch. He drank the wine in his glass in one gulp and suppressed the anger in his heart again. Of course, he had a reason to be angry. Before this, the intelligence work of the secret organization was mostly under his control. Even the first-hand information had to go through him first. Enoch didn't think highly of Josiah. She was just a silly girl. How capable could she be? The facts proved this point. After the secret organization was established, Josiah focused on publicity, and Enoch successfully grasped the intelligence in his hands. Of course, it wasn't easy to achieve this. Enoch put in a lot of effort in this. However, everything changed after Tang arrived. Josiah began to consciously reclaim the right to intelligence. Even when she was out of town, the intelligence was sent to her first. At this time, Enoch suddenly realized that he had put most of his attention on how to get the intelligence from Josiah and neglected to build a good relationship with the low-level intelligence personnel. Now that Josiah's existence in the intelligence field was restored, the intelligence personnel instantly changed their allegiance. They abandoned him without hesitation and sent the intelligence to her. How could Enoch not be furious in his heart when all his hard work had gone to the extent of benefiting someone else? He didn't believe that Josiah's change was the result of a sudden epiphany. The problem was obviously with Tang in, first you stopped me from becoming the leader of the secret organization, then you destroyed the foundation I worked so hard to build. Tang in, you little brat, how can I tolerate you? Just as Enoch's mind was filled with all kinds of thoughts, suddenly, clop, 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 there were a few crisp sounds of horse hooves, and they finally stopped at the entrance of the tavern. Captain Tang. Captain is back. A young man, sitting on the outside, suddenly cheered and instantly got up to greet the door. The tables and chairs were pushed, and the rest of the people went up to greet him. Phew! Enoch, who was at the back, let out a long breath. He reached out and rubbed his face. After showing a rather warm smile, he got up and walked to the door. Welcome. Chapter 417. You're a leader. How can you hand over the task to your subordinates right after you arrive and run out to shop by yourself? And is there a problem? It's not a big problem, but I still have to put on an act. So noisy. There are so many people who want to shop with me. You're not the only one. I admit that. But can you please restore your original appearance first? You're putting a lot of pressure on me now. Simpson and his group had caused a huge commotion, so the secret organization naturally received the news. After Tang and Josiah entered the tavern by the creek, they learned that the other party would probably arrive in Mountain Stream City in 2 days. Tang and the others were, of course, a little helpless with such an outcome. After all, Tang and Josiah's journey was really like a vacation. Even so, it could not compare to the other party's procrastination skills. Moreover, there was actually nothing to prepare for this negotiation. The Gray Coat Army had the advantage of taking the initiative, and now there was a clear condition in hand. When the time came, it was nothing more than bargaining and wasting some saliva. Therefore, after Josiah went to the tavern by the creek and greeted the higher-ups, he stayed for less than half a day. In the afternoon, he threw the condition to Enoch and the others, saying that they should study the corresponding strategy based on it. Then he turned his head and pulled Tang in, who was resting in the house, out to shop in the city. Originally, it was a good thing to shop with a beautiful woman. However, the key point was that Josiah was now shopping in high-end clothing stores, while she was disguised as an ordinary woman who was severely malnourished and looked weak. One look at her clothes, and one could tell that she was someone who was hovering on the line between food and clothing. Although Tang did not disguise himself, his unremarkable face and unchanging black clothes looked really out of place in this environment. In fact, whether it was Tang or Josiah, they were both rich and had no problem buying clothes that they liked. However, Josiah just wanted to try it out and left after that. This naturally caused many people to roll their eyes at him. See, I'm being despised again. Tang shrugged as he led Josiah through the women's clothing store. In such a high-end shop, the quality of the waiters was pretty good. At the very least, they hadn't been kicked out of the house yet. However, there were still some looks of disdain and vigilance. However, Josiah didn't mind at all. He was in high spirits as he wandered around the luxurious robes. He wasn't affected at all. The color and style of this dress are not bad. Let me try it on. Josiah took a fancy to a cotton skirt with a white fur collar. He happily took off the clothes and walked to the dressing area at the back, which was surrounded by thick cloth. Understood. Tang shrugged and glanced at the waitress who was about to come up and dissuade him. It was a rule not to chase customers away, but these waiters had plenty of ways to make customers who didn't know their limits back off. It wasn't all disdain. After all, they were facing the nobles and wealthy merchants. If this piece of clothing was worn by someone of a lower status, those nobles who thought they were cut above the rest would most likely not buy this piece of clothing. However, when the waitress who was about to stop him reached out her hand, she suddenly felt a chill from the sky. Her hair stood on end and her footsteps froze in place. This momentary pause was very short. When the waitress inexplicably came back to her senses, Josiah had already left and walked into the dressing area. Tang touched his nose as he avoided the waitress's suspicious gaze and walked to the side. Sigh. If the old butler knew that I used the killing intent skill here, he would probably be speechless. Since what was done couldn't be undone, naturally no one would go in and drag Josiah out. In the end, the waitress had to follow Tang in step by step and waited outside the dressing area. Her intentions were obvious. First, she was afraid that the dress would be damaged. Second, she was worried that Tang In was a thief or something. Of course, Tang In didn't care about her thoughts. He sat on a soft chair and looked around with great interest. From time to time, he would pick up the tea and snacks at hand and put them into his mouth. After meeting the surprised gazes of the people around him, he politely nodded and showed a leisurely demeanor. The business of shop in this location was naturally good, so there were many men waiting outside the dressing area. At first glance, most of them were nobles and wealthy merchants. They were all stunned when they saw Tang Un's polite gesture. Then, they looked up and down and had a mocking smile. It was as if they were watching a joke. They didn't ridicule or reject him. After all, when the difference in status between the two parties was too big, it was meaningless to say such things. After a moment, Josiah, who had changed his clothes, opened the thick curtain and walked out. "Miss, how are you?" The waitress immediately walked up and was about to politely ask the other party to take off his clothes. But in an instant, she couldn't help but stutter and murmur. She was stunned on the spot. Josiah didn't care about the situation. As soon as he came out, he looked up and met Tang In's gaze. His lips curled up slightly. He stroked his dress and turned around. Then, he put one hand on his waist, and the other hand slightly lifted the side of his dress. He tilted his head and said with a smile, "Am I beautiful?" Was he beautiful? In an instant, the surrounding space quieted down. The expressions of the nobles and wealthy merchants on the side froze in surprise, amazement, and so on. Josiah's figure was very good. With his slender legs and well-proportioned body, he was a natural clothes hanger. In addition, he didn't hide his outstanding temperament at all. For a moment, the crowd actually forgot about his disguised face and was immersed in it. Tang In was also a little stunned. It was mainly because Josiah was basically wearing a disguise now. He only wore a long robe and covered all his beauty. Now that he was wearing suitable clothes, he suddenly bloomed without any concealment. Naturally, he was dazzling. Wow! After coming back to his senses, Tang In rubbed his palms and showed an exaggerated admiration. Seeing this reaction, Josiah covered his mouth and laughed cheerfully again. Then he pursed his lips, lowered his palms, and bowed his back slightly. The otherworldly temperament just now disappeared in an instant, as if it was an illusion. A dozen sighs were let out at the same time. The surrounding nobles and wealthy merchants came back to their senses with a disappointed look. They first looked at Tang In amazement. Then they blinked and blinked again. They looked at Josiah in disbelief, who now looked like an ugly duckling. The long dress no longer had the magical power it had earlier. It looked awkward on Joshua's body, no matter how one looked at it. Miss, do you want to buy it?" The waitress was the closest just now and felt it more clearly. She didn't completely come back to her senses and asked mechanically. "No," Josiah responded bluntly. He turned around and walked back to the changing room. "Please think about it again. The collar of this dress is made from the fur of the rouge fox's chest." The waitress subconsciously tried harder. Ordinary nobles and wealthy merchants also liked this. But halfway through her words, she suddenly reacted. After looking at Josiah's pale face again, she reached out and patted her forehead. She changed into the emotionless tone from before. "Then, miss, please take off this dress." Then, as if she wanted to make up for the previous two mistakes, she added, "It's very expensive. You can't afford to pay for it." Josiah stopped in his tracks and turned to look at the waitress with a frown. The waitress had completely returned to her previous state. She reached out her hand. Although she was smiling, there was a rigid indifference and disdain. Raising his eyebrows, Josiah touched the white fur collar and said, "Is it very expensive? But I don't think it's worth the price. The rouge fox's entire body is white. The fur under the neck is also the softest. But the fur there isn't pure white. It has a light pink color. Your collar isn't made from the fur on the rouge fox's chest. Josiah was originally of noble birth. As long as one was a noble woman, regardless of whether they were willing or not, they would have done research on clothing, rouge, and the like. What's more, she was a mage known for her encyclopedic knowledge and strong memory. She knew all kinds of information about magical beasts in her heart. The words that the waitress usually used as a gimmick to promote simply couldn't pass her test. Nonsense. The waitress was just an ordinary person. Of course, she didn't know these things. She had never seen a magical beast, the rouge fox. After being a little speechless by Josiah, she became even more anxious. This dress was made by the capital's knitting master, Mo Yalin, personally. How could it be wrong again? Josiah interrupted unceremoniously and said strongly, "Don't change the topic. This collar was obviously added to adapt to the northern climate. What does it have to do with Master Mo Yalin? And although I haven't seen Master Mo Yalin, I've read her books. All the clothes made by her will have a Y-shaped mark at the end of the stitches. This is her little habit." He turned up the corner of the collar. "Obviously, there is no mark at all. I now suspect that you are selling fake goods." You're talking nonsense. Hua. Josiah's words were reasonable and resolute. It was hard not to believe. Thus, the nobles and merchants on the side were instantly angry. They didn't care about the money, but they absolutely couldn't tolerate being fooled. A moment later, Tang, In, and Josiah were rudely driven out of the noisy shop entrance. They looked at each other and couldn't help but laugh. The chaos just now wasn't small. Because it involved the nobles and merchants, it was enough to give the shop a headache for a while. Giving a thumbs up, Tang In smiled and praised sincerely. "I didn't know that you had this trick up your sleeve." Josiah raised his head and said proudly, "There are many things that you can't see. Besides, isn't it just lying? Who doesn't know how to do it?" "A lie?" Tang In opened his mouth in shock and asked in surprise, "What you said just now was all a lie. It's half true and half false. The front is true. The back." Josiah showed a sly smile. "The end of the stitches is the skirt, not the collar. I saw it inside. There's a Y-shaped mark on the skirt." Hee. Tang In touched his forehead and said speechlessly, "You're really something." I'm just trying to give you face. I saw the eyes of those nobles and merchants. How is it? Do you have a sense of accomplishment as a man? Of course. Yeah. After laughing, the two happily changed to another commercial street and continued to shop. Josiah looked at Tang In next to him and pursed his lips. The corners of his mouth couldn't help but curl up. Just like what Dave said before, whether he admitted it or not, Josiah's feelings did have some qualitative changes after Tang In escaped from the space crack. Just like today, Josiah originally planned to discuss the list of conditions with the higher-ups. However, when he felt the different gazes of his subordinates, his heart moved and he immediately pulled Tang In out to shop. This feeling was very strange. It wasn't a day or two that his subordinates were interested in her. Josiah naturally noticed it, but it wasn't good to directly reject them. However, when Tang In was next to her, she didn't hesitate to pull Tang In out and shatter the fantasies of those young men. And the scene in the shop just now. If it was under normal circumstances, Josiah wouldn't have exposed that the apron wasn't made from the chest fur of the rouge fox. But before that, she saw the surrounding people looking at Tang In with envy, and an uncontrollable sense of pride suddenly surged in her heart. Then, the waiter couldn't ruin this feeling. Joshua still couldn't understand why she was doing this, but the thought that came from the unseen world made her do it naturally. Since that was the case, then let nature take its course. A few steps away, Tang In turned his head and looked at Josiah, who was a little stunned, and asked in confusion, "Why are you standing there?" Nothing." His face was a little hot, but fortunately he disguised it. Josiah pointed to the clothing shop next to him and said, "This shop looks good. Let's go in and take a look." "Again? In?" Tang In spread his hands helplessly. Then, his long and narrow eyes suddenly narrowed. He looked around, then looked at the shop sign and touched his nose. Are you sure it's this shop? Josiah also reacted at this time. He looked at this somewhat familiar shop and said hesitantly, "This is the shop where you killed Eunice?" "Correct." "Well, let's go in and see Eunice's taste." Tang and shrugged. He was surprised just now, but it didn't matter now. However, when the two stepped into the shop, their footsteps suddenly stopped, and then they looked inside in astonishment. Chapter 4:18. In the high-end shop. "Sir, do you think I look good in this? And this one?" "It's all good." She lowered her voice. But I like you even more when you're not wearing anything." Sir." She dragged out her tone and acted coquettishly. "What? You're not sincere at all." "Oh, then, if you like it, just take it. You don't have to save money for me." Haha, things in this small place are cheap." The slightly vulgar and arrogant words, although lacking elegance, could undeniably bring a sense of vanity to some women. The waiter on the side was naturally more excited. His face flushed, and he kept saying all kinds of tempting words, promoting one expensive piece of clothing after another to the woman beside the nouveau riche. Not far from them, there was a noble man and woman who came in with them, choosing clothes. However, this man did not show the temperament of his companion, but smiled and gave professional advice according to the figure and temperament of his female companion. "This one is very nice, sir. What do you think?" "Well, you have good taste. This one is really good. However, your skin is white and your curves are voluptuous. Actually, it's not suitable for you to wear this kind of flashy short skirt. Well, this one suits you better. Although the neckline is a bit low, it won't look exaggerated with a string of white beads. Moreover, it can better highlight your wonderful figure." "Haha, thank you, sir." To be able to match an already gorgeous flower with suitable green leaves. "You know, it's my honor." It had to be said that although this rather handsome man did not have the air of wealth, his decent words and actions were undoubtedly very popular with his female companion. "It's undoubtedly this womanizer." Tang touched his nose to make sure he did not misjudge him, and then looked at Josiah. Both of them were a little surprised. Shouldn't he still be a few cities away? But since they met, of course, they had to say hello. Tang walked forward and put his hand on the shoulder of the handsome young man. "This big brother is very experienced. I admire. Well, can you give some advice to my female companion?" "No problem, Tang. The handsome young man turned around gracefully. Then he stammered with a frightened expression. The corners of Tang's mouth curled up slightly, and he was about to say something. Unexpectedly, the handsome young man quickly glanced at Josiah's face, who had a faint smile on his face. He breathed a sigh of relief. Then he looked at Josiah's figure and was suddenly startled. His complexion changed, and he rushed forward to hug Tang in. He kept patting his back and said excitedly, "Aha, what a coincidence. I didn't expect to meet you here. Say, is this Josiah?" The last sentence was whispered in his ear. Tang could not help but be stunned for a moment before he reacted. It was true that Josiah had disguised himself before, but he was still lacking in skill. If it was someone familiar or someone with sharp eyes, they would still be able to see through the flaws. But this handsome young man had both. Not only did he have sharp eyes for women, but he was also very familiar with Josiah. More importantly, he knew about Tang's disguise skills. So, it was not surprising that he could guess it. Just when Tang was a little stunned, the handsome young man undoubtedly got the answer. He loosened his arm and took a step back. First, he waved at the local tyrant, who was not far away. Then, he waved his hand and said seriously, "Well, let me introduce you. This is Tang, and this is—" He hesitated, as if he did not know Josiah's identity, and vaguely said, "Tang's friend." Then he pointed to the somewhat baffled noble lady beside him. "As for this lady, Philip, what's wrong?" The burly local tyrant walked over with a few people and asked, puzzled. Philip quickly gave a signal with his eyes and went up to greet the local tyrant, pulling him over. "This is Sir Alex, and this noble lady is his sister." "Well, she's also my sister." "Ha!" A series of tongue-twisting introductions were said quickly, making everyone who heard it a little dumbfounded. Tang, on the other hand, was clear-headed. Looking at Philip, who was pretending to be calm and the traces of sweat on his temples, he could not help but smile slightly and secretly laugh. This guy's reaction was fast. It was a pity that he did not go into acting. In fact, Philip's series of actions only had one goal, and that was to draw a clear line between them. Tang Yin knew that Philip wanted to pursue Josiah. Even most of the people in the Gray Coat Army's encampment knew about it. After all, his previous actions of playing the piano under the moonlight and using the washing machine to curry favor had caused a great impact. Now that Josiah had coincidentally caught him flirting with a girl, he naturally had to do his best to explain himself. Putting aside the fact that Philip's good intentions were not of any use, the following conversation became even more awkward. Philip used a boisterous tone to say very empty words to support the situation. His female companion, the noble lady, had inexplicably gained an elder brother and a younger brother. Her mind was in a mess for a moment. Tang and had no intention of helping her out of her predicament. He looked at the situation with interest. It was unknown whether Josiah had seen through the knack of it, but he calmly watched from the sidelines. Alex was also stunned that he had gained a younger sister. However, his reaction was not slow. After receiving Philip's signal, not only did he take advantage of the situation to continue the relationship, he also secretly emphasized it a few times in the following conversation. Then, he discreetly observed Josiah, who had a sickly look on his face with an indescribable and disbelieving expression. This kind of situation naturally did not last long. Just as the sweat on Philip's forehead became more and more obvious, Alex cooperatively laughed a few times and then pulled the noble lady beside Philip to bid farewell. Long time no see. Let's find a place to sit down and have a drink." Philip maintained a stiff smile on his face and suggested to Tang Yin, not daring to look at Josiah. Shrugging his shoulders, Tang Yin casually said, "Sure, that's great. I have a few questions to ask you." They didn't go far and found a tavern nearby. However, a tavern that could be opened in the city square was naturally not the ordinary kind. The interior decoration was very luxurious, and the customers were also nobles, wealthy merchants, and other guests of status. With Philip taking the lead, Tang Yin and Josiah were not troubled by the waiter at the door. The three of them found a quiet place on the second floor and ordered a few glasses of wine to send the waiter away. Tang Yin was truly somewhat puzzled. It was inconvenient to ask when there was a stranger present. After sitting down, he immediately asked, "Philip, why are you here? Is the negotiation team also here?" After arriving here, Philip still did not dare to look at Josiah next to him. It could be said that he was sitting on pins and needles. Now that he heard the question, he hurriedly answered, "No, those old fellows were too slow. Alex and I came here first. So that's how it is." Tang Yin and Josiah looked at each other and secretly nodded. According to the information obtained in advance, the other party should still be 2 days away from arriving. If even this could be wrong, then the secret organization was too weak. The wine was quickly delivered. Just as they began to talk, a waiter came over with a tray. There were 2 glasses of wine and a glass of green juice. Josiah raised the glass of juice to Philip. The latter was flattered at first, but then felt that something was wrong and quickly calmed down. He raised his glass in response and drank half of it. Every action of a noble was standard, and the posture of holding the wine was naturally the same. At this time, Philip was also convinced that the emaciated lady in front of him was Josiah. He could not help but feel a little uneasy. Did she suspect the situation just now? Since Tang Yin and the others were now alone with Philip, it was natural that they would ask about the negotiation. It was unknown whether Philip was trying to make up for his previous performance or if he really did not care, but he completely answered all the questions. Through the conversation, Tang Yin and the others found out about the inside story of the negotiation. Of course, the capital did not have a good impression of the Gray Coat Army. However, the current situation was too tense, and it was not suitable to open up a second battlefield. In addition, the new nobles saw the value of the Gray Coat Army. After some effort, they finally facilitated the current negotiation situation. Of course, It only facilitated the beginning of the negotiation. No one knew the outcome. However, one thing was certain. With the new nobles as a force, there would be corresponding traditional nobles. Naturally, they would not sit back and watch the new nobles increase their strength and continue to grow. The conflict of interest was very complicated and even involved the imperial power of the empire. Behind the scenes, there was the shadow of the eldest prince who represented the traditional nobles and the second prince who was supported by the new nobles. Just like this negotiation, if the two parties were to be mentioned, it would naturally be the Grey Coat Army and the new nobles. However, in the negotiation team here, there were many traditional nobles. On the surface, it was said that they were here to supervise, but everyone knew that they were definitely here to cause trouble. This was the general environment of the negotiation. As for more in-depth, such as the trump card of the new nobles, Philip shook his head and said that he did not know. As if he was afraid that Tang In and the others would not believe him, Philip gave another explanation. It turned out that although Philip was a member of the new nobles and his status was not low, he did not care at all. It was equivalent to just taking up a name. He came here for a completely personal purpose. As for the purpose, Tang In naturally said that it was for Josiah. But then again, such a person should not have been accepted regardless of the group. But his situation was a little special. What was special about it? Philip did not explain clearly and covered it up by stammering. After chatting for so long, although they did not find out the core of the matter, Tang In and the others were already very satisfied. After all, if they did not know the complicated situation of the other party's negotiation team, it was easy to be led into a ditch by people with ulterior motives. Look at my memory. When the scene was a little quiet, Philip slapped his head and looked at Josiah for the first time. He asked with a normal expression, "I still don't know how to address this lady?" "Well, I've been to the Grey Coat Army's encampment, but I haven't seen you." Finally, Tang In raised his eyebrows and looked at Philip, who was pretending to be relaxed but was in fact highly focused. He raised his wine glass and covered the corner of his mouth. The purpose of Philip's inquiry was very simple, and that was to test. From the previous shop to the current tavern, he had pretended not to recognize Josiah. This was undoubtedly to strengthen the authenticity of his previous disguise. And Philip's inquiry was very skillful. If Josiah casually made up a fake name, it basically meant that there were no suspicions. On the other hand, if he said his name directly, it might be that he saw through it. Josiah sipped his fruit juice and smiled. "Chloe." "Phew." Philip exhaled softly and raised his wine glass. He smiled warmly. "Oh, Miss Chloe, nice to meet you." Tang In lowered his head and shrugged his shoulders. What a tragedy. Philip did not know, but Tang In certainly knew that Josiah's full name was Chloe, Josiah. The former was the name of the family. Indeed, Josiah raised his glass and clinked it with Philip's before saying, "Josiah." "Chloe." "Josiah, nice to meet you." "Well, it's getting late. We'll take our leave first." "Thank you for your hospitality." Pausing, he looked at Philip, who seemed to have been struck by lightning magic, and smiled. "Oh right, your sister's not bad. If you have time, let's meet up and go shopping together." The emphasis on the word was self-evident. "Sigh." Tang In stood up, the corner of his mouth twitching. He put on a solemn expression and patted Philip's shoulder. "Brother, my condolences." Chapter 419. The next afternoon, Simpson and his party finally arrived at Mountain Stream City. Nominally, this negotiation team represented the imperial court of the capital city to inspect the various cities in the north. Naturally, this would cause a huge commotion. The city lord had led all the nobles in the city, as well as several famous and wealthy merchants, to wait outside the city early on. Although it was not as exaggerated as a red carpet, the process of a grand ceremonial procession and the citizens lining the streets to welcome them was still essential. Simpson and his party were also very happy. In fact, ever since Alex and Philip had left the team, they had been in a good mood for the past 2 days. Therefore, when they arrived at the welcoming party held by the nobles in the city, They took the opportunity to announce that they would be staying here for a few days to experience the unique charm of the holy city in the north. This way, Ronald and the others had time to negotiate, and the people of Mountain Stream City also felt that they had gained face. It could be said that everyone was happy. With this good start, the party unfolded in an orderly manner. "Hey, Philip." Alex casually walked to the corner of the party hall with a wine glass and clinked his glass with Philip's, who was barely able to raise it. He said disapprovingly, "Why are you still so sick? Haven't you recovered yet?" Sigh. Philip let out a long sigh, looking rather haggard and lonely. He then glanced at him in annoyance. "I knew something would happen. I told you to keep a low profile. You just had to give me a female companion. Look what happened now." Alex scratched his head and said awkwardly, How would I know that it would be so coincidental? Besides, isn't it just a woman? Moreover, it's cough cough. I didn't realize that your taste is getting heavier and heavier." "What do you know?" Philip took a sip of wine, looking very listless. Philip's change in the past 2 days was so obvious that Alex naturally guessed that the source was the emaciated woman in the shop. Combined with what Philip said a few days ago about coming to the north to look for a woman from the Gray Coat Army, everything was obvious. However, Philip did not mention Josiah's disguise, which naturally made Alex feel rather incredulous. The wolf of the Imperial City, who is untainted by thousands of flowers, had actually fallen into the hands of such a woman. Alex had been wondering if there was something wrong with his sense of beauty for the past 2 days. All right, take it easy. There's nothing to be reluctant to part with this kind of trash. Maybe you've just watched too many operas. Isn't that how it's always played out? A noble man falling in love with a commoner girl is because he didn't care about her at first, but then couldn't get her. Haha, that's really fucking bullshit. With a mocking smile on his face, Alex raised his head and drank all the wine in his cup. Then, he pointed at the well-dressed, noble women in front of him. "Look, this is our choice." They had common interests, and because they were raised in the manor, their skin was fair and tender, and they were good at dressing up. They won't be like those commoner women, whose bodies become as bloated as buckets once they're past middle age. Just looking at them makes one lose their appetite. Pausing for a moment, he patted Philip's shoulder. "Your ability to pick up girls is unparalleled in the world, but this is the accumulated experience of an experienced person. You have to believe it." Philip pursed his lips and did not respond to this. He casually changed the topic. "Didn't you come to the north to supervise the family's business? Why aren't you leaving?" F***CK. Hearing this, Alex threw the crystal wine cup heavily on the table with a furious look. "If we don't talk about this, I won't be angry. My family has a few mines in the 100,000 mountains, but they're now sealed off. Or can't be transported out at all, causing me to lose millions of dollars of business." At this point, Alex's eyes suddenly lit up. He leaned closer and said, "Don't you know some people from the Gray Coat Army? Don't even think about it." Philip immediately shook his head and rejected him bluntly. "It's not like you don't know what kind of situation it is now. A little movement is likely to cause a battle of hundreds of thousands of people. Not to mention that I only know them. Even if Leader Losha is my relative, it's useless. Sigh, that's why." Alex spread his hands. "Consider it my bad luck. I can only wait here for you to finish the negotiation." "All right, you can think about what I said just now. I'm going to make a move." Alex got up and took a cup of wine from a passing waiter. He turned around and smiled wretchedly. I noticed just now that there's a dense garden behind this hall. Wow, a person like me is indeed suitable for something as tasteful as a field battle." After saying this, he laughed wretchedly and strode towards the place where the noble women were gathered. Philip didn't care. He continued to stay in this dark corner. His spirits were obviously not lifted. There were a few noble women who came up to him with wine, but they were all rejected by him gloomily. The gathering was still in progress. The focus was naturally on Simpson and the other important people from the capital city. Although they were in the north, as long as they were nobles, they knew that the people who came this time were not all in the same group. The competition between the new nobles and the traditional nobles had been going on for a long time. This time, because the imperial power was involved, it was even more intense. These local nobles couldn't afford to offend either side. It was too dangerous to choose a side too early. Therefore, choosing to please both sides was the most appropriate strategy. Since they were from the capital city, Simpson and the others were naturally a little arrogant. They casually talked about the bustling scenery of the South and the things that weren't here. It was very condescending. Since the local nobles knew that they couldn't afford to offend this group of people, and even wanted to befriend them, they naturally responded with all their might. Thus, the atmosphere of the gathering was lifted. Tang naturally wouldn't let go of such an occasion. He didn't intend to cause trouble. He just wanted to observe and pass on some information, such as, "Sir Ronald, this is for you from a gentleman." A waiter passed him a card while he was changing the wine glasses. This was a normal method in the social circle. There were many people at a gathering, and there were always some things that weren't suitable to be said face to face. Therefore, entrusting a well-trained waiter to pass on a small note was a necessary choice. Moreover, even if the people around saw it, they would take a few steps back to avoid suspicion. Ronald didn't pay much attention to it. He nodded and took the card along with the wine glass. He opened it slightly, and his expression suddenly froze. However, he was someone who had seen a lot. He quickly composed his expression and quietly put the card into his pocket. Not far away, Tang In, who was disguised as a wealthy merchant, nodded. He glanced at Philip, who was in the corner, and silently left the gathering hall. In the first negotiation, both sides didn't have much interaction, so one side had to make the first move. The Greycoat army had always been hidden, so it was unlikely that they would be found. Therefore, the negotiation group made a lot of noise along the way. They also had the intention of letting Tang, and the others make the first move. The content written on the card was simple. It only stated the identity, the time and address of the negotiation. Of course, this was all thanks to Philip. If he hadn't revealed some of the inside stories of the negotiation group, if Tang had sent the card to the traditional noble, Simpson, it might have been silently swallowed up. On this side, the noble negotiation group received a grand welcome and entered the city through the south gate. However, a group of people received an urgent order and were now leaving through the north gate. "Old Bao, this is a little strange." After riding through the city gate, the Bugnes turned around and said with a frown, "We just started a city-wide search, and the order came. Isn't this too much of a coincidence?" Bugnes was talking about yesterday's incident. Bose had suffered a loss after accidentally breaking into House 83. Naturally, he was unwilling to accept it. After returning, not only did he arrange a thorough search plan for all the cavalrymen, but he also visited the large gangs in the city one by one, vowing to find that group of people. However, this search plan had just begun. Today, they received an order from above to investigate a strange case in a nearby city. If it was a normal time, this kind of mutual support would be normal. After all, Bose and the others were now famous. However, it had to be at this time, which made them puzzled. Of course, it was only puzzlement. After all, they had too little information now. Bose nodded. "I've heard of that case. It was decades ago. There's no way to investigate it." After a pause, his right eye flashed coldly. "And this order came in a hurry. It's not from the capital's public security department, but from a northern military division. It seems that someone doesn't want us to investigate that group of people." The capital's public security department was the highest organization directly under the Brand's garrison. As for the northern military division, it was also an organization with the authority of above. It was possible to give orders to the garrison, but it was rare for it to do so without a proper reason. There was a key problem. If the order came from the capital's public security department, it would take at least 10 days for it to reach Bose. However, the Northern Military Division didn't need it. If they were fast, one night would be enough. Such haste naturally made Bose associate it with a group of strange black-clothed men from yesterday. "In that case, Old Bao, what do you plan to do this time? Do you still need to ask?" "Those who dare to hurt my people, of course I'll investigate to the end," Bose said without hesitation. Then, he turned his head and looked at the city gate behind him. He suddenly waved his hand. "Stop!" With the sound of horses neighing, The cavalryman behind him pulled on the reins and stopped. Of course, it's a skillful investigation, Bose said with a sly smile on his face. He continued, when I came out, I had already arranged for a few bandits who were proficient in disguise to be escorted here. He picked 2 people with similar figures to disguise as us and go around the cities to show our faces. Then we'll quietly return. Haha, Bose, oh Bose, I'm so impressed by you. You came up with such a genius idea. It's a good idea. Bugnes nodded in agreement at first, then sighed. But to be able to mobilize the Northern Military Division, the other party must be someone important. Sigh, old bow. Following you is the same as courting death. Don't say that. Bose put his arm around Bugnes' shoulder. You and I are both single men, and we don't want to be promoted and get rich. This is the only fun in our lives. Of course, we have to play it to the end. Why does it sound so unreliable? Bugnes sighed again, then shrugged. But who asked me to partner with you as soon as I entered the police station? Let's do it. Ha, that's right. Chapter 420. The next morning, in an ordinary tavern in the Western District. The location here was not remote, but it was definitely not lively. The tavern basically did business with acquaintances around it, so it could be considered a livelihood. However, since it was early in the morning, naturally no one would come to drink, so most taverns would only open at noon. However, this tavern was now half open, and the fat owner walked out of the door with a smile. Of course, he had reason to be happy because someone had booked this tavern for half a day at a high price, and all they wanted to do was to experience the feeling of opening a tavern. These people were simply crazy. However, it would be better if there were more of such lunatics. The fat shopkeeper thought to himself. Then, he shook his head and calmly went back to rest. He was not worried about the tavern at all. It was not worth much, not to mention that the other party had paid a high deposit. At some point, he even thought about taking the deposit and running away, but when he thought of the ordinary-looking young man who had easily crushed a gold coin into a golden bean in front of him yesterday, he wisely dismissed the idea of courting death. Just as he thought of this, the fat shop owner suddenly saw a familiar figure walking quickly toward him from the corner of his eyes. His body quivered, and then he forced a smile and waved. Hi, sir, good morning. Tang and turned his head, the corners of his mouth raised slightly, and responded politely, Good morning. Taking a walk? He shook his head. No, just going back to rest. Oh, the tavern's door is already open, and your companions are tidying up there. Thank you. I'm sorry to trouble you. You're too polite, sir. Well, I wish you a good morning. I hope so. They greeted each other. Although the other party was very polite, the fat owner quickened his pace and wiped the sweat on his forehead after turning to leave. It seems that yesterday really scared him. Tang watched the fat figure quickly disappear around the corner, shook his head and chuckled, then turned and walked quickly to the tavern. There were a dozen people tidying up the tavern. Except for a long table and a dozen wooden stools in the middle of the tavern, everything else was piled up in the corner. After Tang came in, the old man behind the counter, who was wiping the table and pretending to be the shop owner, nodded kindly. It was Elderba, but he was now disguised as Elderba. During the negotiation, everyone in the tavern was in disguise. It couldn't be helped. When the time came, all the people here would be high-ranking members of the secret organization. If their faces were remembered and their portraits were drawn, they wouldn't be able to do their jobs in the future. Therefore, Tang spent all his free time these few days making camouflage props. Fortunately, other than him and Josiah, the rest were only partially disguised. Otherwise, if everyone had to disguise their entire faces, even a week might not be enough. After greeting Elderba, Tang walked to Josiah's side and sat down. He said, Get ready. They have already set off and will arrive in about 15 minutes. This was a matter of great importance. Even though the other party was the one who proposed this negotiation, it was unlikely that they would play any tricks right from the start. However, they didn't dare to be careless. After all, if this place was surrounded, the secret organization would be wiped out. Therefore, in the end, Tang personally made a trip to make sure that there were no ambushes. Josiah nodded, took a deep breath, and looked around. The work of clearing the stream was nearing completion. These people would withdraw later and take up their weapons to guard the periphery. This long table was pieced together by 2 tables. The material was inferior and there was some old dirt and grease, but it was just long enough to seat 7 people. In addition to Tang In, Elder Bob behind the counter, and Dave, who was disguised as a waiter, were all the high-ranking members of the secret organization. This is an organization that I created, and now it is shouldering an important mission. This tavern is very ordinary, but who would have thought that it carried the long-cherished wish of hundreds of thousands of people in the Gray Coat Army for more than 10 years? Nervousness, excitement, excitement. Many emotions mixed together and formed a mess of distracting thoughts. Phew! He exhaled a mouthful of turbid air and cleared it all away. He turned to Tang In and smiled. This day has finally arrived. Probably understanding Josiah's thoughts, Tang In nodded and said, "Yes, this day has finally arrived." With a smile on his lips, Josiah turned his head and raised his head slightly. His face returned to its usual calmness. "Haha, everyone is growing." Tang In looked at the calm Josiah and recalled his anxious expression during the first negotiation. He couldn't help but feel a little emotional, just like how the Gray Coat Army was growing stronger with each passing day. This young lady who came from a small noble family in the southern city had abandoned her superior life, noble status, and everything that others could only dream of and came to the desolate north alone to seek her own dreams. Now, she had finally undergone a shocking transformation, like a butterfly breaking out of its cocoon. 15 minutes wasn't long, and the cleaning work was completed. The tea that was served later didn't cool down. At a suitable temperature, green smoke rose in spirals. "They're here." Dave, who was wearing a waiter's uniform at the door, suddenly turned around and said. Perhaps because he was nervous, his voice was a little sharp and dragged out. But now, no one laughed at him because other than Tang In, everyone here was more or less a little nervous. If they cared too much, their emotions would inevitably be affected. Tang In had seen too many life and death battlefields, and his mental strength had long been trained. Of course, more importantly, he didn't value the negotiation as much as Josiah and the others, so naturally, he didn't care much. Josiah stood up with a calm expression and slightly curled his lips. "Let's go. Although, I don't want to see those hypocritical faces for a few more seconds. They came all the way here. We have to give them a symbolic welcome." Ha! It wasn't a clever joke, but it was quite effective in this situation. With the laughter, everyone's mood eased a lot, and the tense atmosphere was swept away. Dave, who was at the door, touched his forehead and mocked himself. "No wonder I was so embarrassed just now. It's because I saw them for a few more seconds than you guys." Sigh. Huh. On the street in front of the tavern, more than a dozen luxurious carriages and hundreds of fully armed cavalry approached at a uniform speed. "It's here?" Simpson lifted the curtains and looked at the houses on the street. He frowned and pursed his lips. Lowly people will always be lowly people. They chose such a run-down place for such an important negotiation. Don't tell me they don't value it. The important thing is the negotiation, not the environment. Sir Simpson. Of course, Ronald wouldn't fall for such a low-level provocation. He said calmly, "Also, I have to remind you, we're the main force in this negotiation. So, no matter what you think, please don't call us lowly people during the negotiation. Otherwise, you have the right to supervise us, and we have the right to interfere with the negotiation and expel you." Huffed. Simpson sneered disapprovingly and turned his head. "Don't tell me they're not lowly people in your hearts? Even if they're normally, they aren't during negotiations." Simpson shook his head and glanced at him. "You new nobles are really unscrupulous in order to develop. But, low-quality pearls can never be mounted on a crown. Just like how they can't help you in the future. I'm afraid they're so nervous that they've forgotten their surnames." Before he finished speaking, faint laughter suddenly came from the front. Simpson's curtains didn't fall, so it was obvious that the laughter came from the target tavern. Spreading out his hands, Ronald smirked. "Obviously, I'm not nervous." Being slapped in the face, even Simpson, who was shrewd, couldn't help but blush. He snorted and lowered the curtains. Since they could hear the laughter, they weren't far from each other. A moment later, more than a dozen luxurious carriages stopped a dozen meters away from the tavern. The people in the carriages hadn't alighted yet, but the cavalry suddenly split into two wings and rushed out. It was obvious that they wanted to surround the tavern. The cavalry in front of them didn't slow down, but instead increased their speed. They aggressively charged toward Josiah and the others at the door. Damn it! Dave's expression changed, and he reached for his sword. But his wrist was caught by Josiah in an instant. Don't be rash. Tang pursed his lips and reached into his pocket, muttering, "What an old-fashioned show of strength." When he reached out, a crossbow appeared and aimed at the dozen or so cavalrymen, who were already close to 5 meters away, and swung it. Hiss, hiss, hiss. The horses neighed, and the cavalry subconsciously tightened their reins. The front hooves of the war horses were raised high, as if they were standing up, and then they landed heavily. Obviously, they were planning to do this in front of Tang and the others. As long as it was a normal person, they would naturally panic if they were caught off guard. Thus, the purpose of showing off their strength was achieved. But in the blink of an eye, they didn't expect the cavalry to take out a crossbow. This time, it was their turn to be caught off guard. Fortunately, these people's riding skills were very good, and they didn't roll off the back of their horses, which would seriously damage their morale. At this moment, the neighing of horses could be heard from the surroundings of the tavern. Obviously, the cavalry's flanking tactic had encountered difficulties. Originally, this location was chosen by Josiah and the others, and they planned to take advantage of the home ground. How could they be surrounded by the enemy? Thump, thump, thump. The cavalry a few meters away got off their horses and strode towards the door. Get out of the way. To ensure the safety of everyone, we have to go in and search. How could the people here be obedient and get out of the way? They all crossed their arms and blocked the door, as if they didn't hear anything. The leading cavalry frowned and took another step forward. He reached out his hand and said, "Get out of the way." Before he finished speaking, a strange sound was heard. The cavalry's outstretched hand was covered with a layer of ice from his fingers to his gauntlet, and finally to his shoulder. "Magician!" Exclamations were heard, followed by the sound of swords being half unsheathed. Josiah ignored the intense movements of the cavalry. He stepped forward and said coldly, "Tell your superiors that you can enter this room." They could enter the room at the back, but they had to be the negotiator. As for you, sorry, you're not qualified. Chapter 4:21. Since it was a negotiation, it was only natural for them to use such a vulgar but effective move to intimidate the nobles. This was not the spontaneous action of these knights, nor was it the private order of the traditional nobles. Ronald and the others knew about this and tacitly agreed to it. In fact, the noble negotiation team more or less looked down on the Gray Coat army. Moreover, no matter what, if they could suppress the other party's momentum, it would be of great benefit to the upcoming negotiation. However, the expected panic did not happen. Instead, the knights on their side kicked an iron plate. They could not enter, and it was even more impossible for them to return and pass on the message. Although the nobles opened the curtains and saw this scene, they naturally could not show weakness and walk out. For a moment, the front of the tavern fell into an awkward situation. At this moment, "Why are you pulling me?" "Hey, everyone! Hello! Don't pull me!" The people on Tang inside looked sideways and saw half of Philip's body poking out from the back of the carriage. He was resisting the pull from inside, while waving his hand to greet them. The tense atmosphere immediately eased. The cavalrymen glanced at each other before retreating at the same time. Philip finally broke free from the pull, and at the same time, he pulled out a middle-aged noble with a helpless expression. Then, the majestic Ares walked out with a smile on his face. "Ha, long time no see. Good luck, I have high hopes for you." Philip walked 2 steps forward and walked to the front of the tavern. He did not care how many people he knew and shook hands with them warmly. The corners of Simpson and Ronald's eyes twitched a few times. However, since the awkward situation was no longer there, they did not have to be in a deadlock. They all walked out of the carriage. It was as if the previous display of strength did not happen. Everyone greeted each other with a normal expression. Although the atmosphere was not lively, at least the scene was not too ugly. After exchanging some pleasantries, Joshua gestured for them to enter and led them into the tavern. Come in, don't be shy." Philip stood at the door and greeted them enthusiastically. Diff, who was at the side, was a little stunned. Who is this guy? And whose side is he on? The nobles were already numb to this. They walked in expressionlessly. But as soon as they entered the tavern, another problem arose. What a shabby place. What kind of joke is this? Is this the negotiation table? This 7 teacups can only seat 7 people? Damn it. You want so many of us to sit on the ground? Are you sure you know what negotiation is? Angry voices of doubt rang out one after another. Some of them were sowing discord among the traditional nobles, while others were truly annoyed. After the tavern was cleaned up, only 2 long tables were left in the hall. The condition was so simple that it made one's hair stand on end. The key point was that this table could only seat 7 people, and there were at least 20 to 30 people in the negotiation team. Naturally, this was not enough. Papa! Josiah clapped his hands twice and waited for the scene to quiet down before saying calmly, "No matter how good the environment is, it has nothing to do with the negotiation. Moreover, there are 7 people, which is enough to start a negotiation. As for the extra people," he pointed to the wooden stools piled up in the corner. "There are stools over there. You can choose to sit on the outside or stand. Please help yourself." After he finished speaking, he waved his hand and sat down. He lowered his head and flipped through the negotiation terms in front of him. Bang! Simpson strode forward and slammed his hand on the table, causing the teacups to shake. He roared angrily. "You've gone too far. You obviously don't value the negotiation. I think there's no need to negotiate at all. Damn it, this dirty table." After he slammed his hand, Simpson immediately regretted it. He took out a white silk handkerchief and wiped his hand continuously. "Sir Simpson," Tang, and held his chin with one hand and suddenly raised his head to ask. Simpson was slightly stunned. "If I remember correctly, this negotiation doesn't seem to have anything to do with you. Well, congratulations, you don't have to sit on this so-called dirty table." Simpson opened his mouth, his face full of shock. If his name was known, it might have been because the commotion earlier was too big and it was accidentally revealed. However, even the factions and the inside story of the negotiation were known to the other party. This made him a little dumbfounded. "I'm sorry, the Grey Coat Army is not as rich as you, even though I think that every gold coin you have is stained with blood. We don't care about ostentation. The negotiation table is right here. If you want to negotiate, sit down. If you don't want to, we won't force you. Everyone, please go back to your homes and find your mothers." "You?" These words were undoubtedly arrogant. Simpson's old face flushed red, and he was about to roar again in anger. "Hey, what are you all standing here for? Sit down." Philip, who was the last to enter, saw the crowd in front of him. He once again acted like a host and called out to everyone. Of course, not many people would listen to Philip's unreliable words. In the end, it was Ronald, who had been silent all this while, who said, "Since things have come to this, let's negotiate first." Since the noble negotiation team could be here, it was naturally led by the new nobles. Simpson and the others were only responsible for supervising the negotiation. Now that Ronald had spoken, it was a temporary conclusion. No matter what, the disturbance caused by the negotiation environment and limited seating was over. Next, the nobles would discuss who was qualified to sit on the table. First of all, Ronald was the senior and the leader of the new nobles. Naturally, he had a seat. As soon as he finished speaking, he walked to the center of the long table in front of Josiah. However, in an instant, someone took the seat first. Ronald looked at the person and raised his eyebrows. "Philip, you..." He couldn't continue his sentence. That's right, the person who had snatched the seat was Philip. After he sat down, he sat in an extremely standard posture, unlike his usual lazy appearance. He looked like a soldier waiting to be inspected. However, his gaze was a little erratic. He would look at Josiah for a while, and then quickly look away. Do you have any questions? After hearing Ronald's words, Philip turned his head slightly and spread his hands. My rank is higher than yours. In terms of status among the new nobles, I'm also higher than you. Is there a problem with me sitting here? Ronald was tongue-tied. He was so angry that he almost fainted. There was no doubt that he was the leader of this negotiation. He was also the one who made the final decision. However, what Philip said was not wrong. Regardless of identity or status, Philip, who had always been unreliable, was indeed a head above him. Ronald's chest rose and fell several times. In the end, he let out a long breath. He still prioritized the overall situation and sat heavily on Philip's left. On the opposite side, other than Tang, In, and Josiah, Enoch and the others were a little confused. Was this an internal conflict? Of course, Tang didn't think so. Seeing this, the corners of his mouth curled up. There was no doubt that this guy was planning to apologize today. Alex, who was at the back of the crowd, was also surprised. He looked at Philip and then looked at the ordinary woman who was at most delicate and pretty. He opened his mouth. What's going on? Why did he fall in love with someone else so quickly? And his taste was so unique. Could this guy have fallen in love with all the women in the Gray Coat Army? It had to be said that because of Philip's interference and many accidents, this negotiation now looked more like a farce. However, no matter what, this was the first official contact after all. The negotiation had to continue. After some chaos, the nobles finally found their seats. The 6 new nobles and Simpson sat at the negotiation table. The others took wooden stools piled up in the corner and sat in a semicircle around the negotiation table. Since the negotiation had begun, it was natural for them to introduce themselves. Tang inside reported fake names, of course. As for the opposite side, other than the clerk on the far right, the other nobles were all titled marquises and earls. Philip didn't report his name. He was in a daze. Of course, no one would pay attention to him. Since it was a negotiation, the first thing to confirm was the person who could make the final decision. Now, these 7 positions were easy to identify. Ronald and the others cast their gazes on Josiah. They couldn't see through her disguise, but at least they could confirm that she was a young woman. They didn't mean to underestimate her. After all, although they didn't see the magic attack just now, they could still feel that she was difficult to deal with from Josiah's short but concise words. Moreover, when they reported their noble titles, they had the intention of pressuring the other party. But now, it seemed that it didn't have any effect at all. What made them even more surprised was that there seemed to be a vaguely familiar scent on her. Yes, that was the feeling of a noble. While Ronald was sizing her up, Josiah and the others didn't do so. They had received information beforehand and knew who was the main force in this negotiation. As for Philip, who had suddenly appeared, well, just ignore him. On the surface, the negotiation this time meant that both sides had reached a settlement. The Bran was willing to pay a price in exchange for the Gray Coat Army's army, not to invade the rear cities and disrupt the deployment at the front lines. On a deeper level, the new nobles wanted to seek cooperation with the Gray Coat Army. Both sides would take what they needed. Of course, the latter couldn't be put on the table. In summary, the Gray Coat Army had the right to set a price. Josiah didn't hold back. After both sides tested each other, he began to list his demands one by one. The scene became lively all of a sudden. What? Return the land to the commoners. That's our land. They used our seeds and our farming tools. In the end, our land still belongs to them. What kind of joke is this? Sir Simpson, I don't have time to joke with you. The nobles already have enough land, but they still use all kinds of methods to seize it. What we want is the land that has been seized. Facts have already proven that if the commoners have their own land, they will be more motivated and the production of crops will increase. This way, the empire will become more powerful. This is a win-win situation. Win-win my ass. You can't touch a single cent of the nobles' things. Ronald, if you dare to agree to these conditions, I guarantee that you will die a horrible death. Let the commoners enter the academy? Ha, what a joke. They only need a farm. What's the point of learning those things? The teachings of the God of Light say that God's love for everyone is equal. If that's the case, why can't the commoners enter the academy? At the same time, this is also for the empire to export talents. Haha, only a short-sighted person like you would find this laughable. You, how dare you? Sigh. Sir Simpson, don't be rash. We're all civilized people. Don't say such harsh words. What's more, if you listen carefully, what he said does make some sense. Philip, whose side are you on? I'm warning you. You're warning me? Haha, everyone listen. He dares to warn me. Why don't you King warn me? The purpose of the Grey Coat Army was to promote the status and interests of the commoners. This would inevitably affect the interests of the nobles. Therefore, this kind of intense confrontation was the inevitable outcome. Simpson had come with the intention of disrupting the negotiations. When he heard these conditions, he was even angrier. Towards the end of the negotiations, it was almost him and the traditional nobles arguing with Josiah's side. At this moment, he finally saw how powerful this ordinary-looking woman was. His words were sharp, and his logic was meticulous. Almost every word he said hit the nail on the head, making people want to suffocate from the anger in their chests. Tanga did not say anything. Josiah was enough, and the effect was obvious. The tea that Simpson disdained in the beginning was now being refilled again and again. Almost every time it was refilled, he would drink it in one gulp. If it were not for the support of the other traditional nobles behind him, he would probably be nailed to the bench stupidly by the words on this side. Ronald also did not speak much, nor did he argue. He only instructed the recorder to record the conditions and then sat there silently. Only when he heard Josiah say that the commoners should participate in the political power did his almost closed old eyes light up. He did not express his opinion, other than Philip, who was making jokes and seemed like he was taking sides. The new nobles naturally did not make things difficult for him. In the end, the focus of the negotiations had shifted from the negotiation table to the arguments on and off the table. Conditions were raised, arguments were raised, arguments were raised, arguments were raised. This negotiation began to shift more and more to a quarrel on the streets. The people involved argued until their faces turned red, and they almost resorted to violence. The onlookers watched with relish and were very indifferent. To be honest, it was impossible to reach a conclusion in the first round of negotiations. More importantly, it was a battle of momentum. Now, it seemed that the scene was at least imposing enough. The endless arguments almost ran through the entire negotiation process in the morning. P.S. There are two things. 1. Civet bowed and wished all readers a happy National Day. If you can go home for a reunion, please do so. Civet now deeply understood that the happiness of his family was more important than anything else. 2. From the 3rd to the 6th, Civet has to go out for something. He should be able to update 6,000 words normally. If not, please forgive him. He will come back and make up for it and explode. Chapter 422. Shopkeeper, everything is here. Can you check and see if there's any loss? No need, no need. Oh, here's the deposit. I'll return it to you. How is it? Are you feeling well? Not bad. We have a group of customers. That's good, that's good. At noon, the fat shopkeeper regained his tavern. After a few words of small talk, he respectfully sent the two people in front of him out the door. The thoughts of nobles are really unpredictable. Watching the two disappear around the corner, the fat shopkeeper let out a long sigh. There was a hint of envy in his tone. In fact, he had come back once in the middle of the journey. He did not go near, but looked from afar. He saw more than 10 luxurious carriages parked in front of his inconspicuous tavern, surrounded by many knights in bright armor. As such, the two of them were naturally categorized as nobles by him. On the side of the street, Tang In and Josiah walked side by side in the crowd. Phew! Josiah let out a long sigh of relief. He raised his hands high and made a gesture of relief. He pursed his lips. Seriously, after arguing for an entire morning, we still couldn't reach a deal. Once could determine success or failure. That's kidnapping and extortion. Tang and spread his hands indifferently. At least you embarrassed that annoying old man, didn't you? Josiah heard this and smiled. If that's the case, I've gained something. I feel much better now. Huh. They were talking about the situation after the negotiation in the morning. When Simpson left, he actually knocked his foot on the door sill and rolled on the floor in embarrassment. At his age, it was inevitable that his chi and blood would not flow well after sitting for such a long time. Of course, Josiah's contribution in this was not small. It was precisely because of her words that Simpson's mood fluctuated and his hair stood on end. His old face was in a state of congested blood. The combination of the two eventually led to this tragedy. It was conceivable that such a shameful matter would spread among the noble circles. When the time came, it was very likely that Simpson would be speechless after being refuted by the other party during the negotiation. In the end, he missed a step. Perhaps it was because he thought of the situation that Simpson's eyes rolled back and he fainted after falling down. This caused another round of chaos and almost caused the two parties to fight. By the way, Simpson won't die just like that, right? Josiah turned around and asked after gloating. A little sympathy? He's an old man after all. And if he really dies because of this, I'm afraid we can't continue our negotiations. Women are indeed the most vicious. Don't worry, he shouldn't die. How do you know? Shrugging his shoulders, Tang In said, At that time, I was at the back. There was someone, that Alex was right beside me. I heard him muttering something about pretending to faint again. See, he's experienced. He won't die so easily. Is that so? He waved his fist. Well, I'll work harder next time and try to make him faint again. Expressionless, he said, Do your best, do your best. In the afternoon, in a high-class hotel in the center of Mountain Stream City. This was the place where the noble negotiation team stayed in Mountain Stream City. The reason why they didn't stay in the East District where the nobles invited them was, of course, for the convenience and confidentiality of the negotiations. But even so, with their status, the entire hotel was booked and surrounded by guards. At this time, in front of the hotel, a middle-aged noble was sending a white-bearded doctor out. Then, he shook his head with a smile and walked back to the empty tavern hall. As if he remembered something, he stopped and turned to the counter and said, Make a bowl of nourishing soup and send it to room 1. Yes. Without stopping, he walked through the elegantly decorated courtyard and entered the attic. Then, he directly walked past room 1 and stopped in front of room 9 at the end of the corridor. He looked around and pushed the door open. Sir Simpson is fine. Now I'm starting to believe what Alex said. That old maggot isn't pretending, right? Old maggot was a derogatory term for the traditional nobles by the new nobles. On the contrary, in the mouth of the traditional nobles, the new nobles were nouveau riche. As mentioned before, although I'd rather he be Bedridden, but it doesn't have much to do with us, does it? The person who spoke was Ronald, and this was his room. But now, there were many people gathered here. Except for Philip, almost all the new nobles in the negotiation team were present. Ronald looked around and said, Well, while those people are visiting Simpson, let's discuss what to do. After a moment of silence, the middle-aged noble said, These few days, I've asked someone to get some news from the military in the north. The Greycoat Army's current strength is not low, and what's more terrifying is the speed at which it is expanding. I think they fully meet the conditions of being an ally of the new nobles. This was more or less nonsense, but it was a meeting, so some nonsense was always needed to lead to the next topic. Sure enough, a younger noble stood up and said, But the key is, how can we reach a cooperation agreement with the Greycoat Army? You've all heard the conditions put forward by the other party today. Although those old maggots have been refuting, we definitely can't agree. Silence. All the nobles present nodded silently. One's head determined one's position. This was a principle that prevailed everywhere. The new nobles were still nobles, and they also had vested interests. To put it bluntly, they just wanted to seize more power and more say from the traditional nobles. But the conditions put forward by Josiah today had already touched the lifeblood of the nobles. As for what Josiah said was also beneficial to the empire, how could they not know this? But their position had already determined that they could not do this. If they did, then what Simpson said today was really not a threat. If you dare to agree to these conditions, I guarantee you will die a horrible death. After a moment of silence, Ronald spoke. It's impossible that they don't know this. It should be a negotiation strategy. They can't touch the land, but it's still possible to let the commoners enter the academy. Well, I think so too. That's true. However, this is also very difficult. Let's take the matter of commoners entering the academy as an example. And I'll put it bluntly. We and the commoners are on two different levels. If we let our children mix with the commoners, when they grow up, will they no longer respect or fear us? This noble was indeed straightforward, but that was the logic behind it. Apart from creating beauty, distance also created a mysterious sense of authority. Usually, the nobles were high and mighty, and the commoners could not come into contact with them. Naturally, they would speculate, and the unknown was always terrifying. But if they lived together, the commoners would discover that the nobles were not much different from them. In some areas, they were not as good as the commoners, and so on. In this way, the mysterious feeling would naturally disappear. This is a problem, but it can be solved. Ronald seemed to have thought about it a lot during the negotiation. He said directly, "We can build another academy that accepts commoners. This way, this problem will not exist." Good idea, I agree. I agree too. Sir Ronald is indeed the pillar of our new nobles. Well said exactly. Waving his hand, Ronald seemed very calm, but it felt good to be praised. The corners of his mouth curled up, and he said, "We can do the same for other less sensitive conditions. We can always think of a way to deal with it, but the key now is..." He paused, as if he was organizing his words, and then said, "Don't forget, His Highness is still waiting for our news. We have to make the other party accept the 3 votes in the parliament. I don't think the other party will refuse this, because they also have the conditions for commoners to participate in the political power. But how do we make the other party accept the conditions that come from this, disband the army?" The 3 votes in the parliament were what the new nobles wanted. If there was a dispute in the empire, the parliament would need a vote. However, the traditional nobles had a natural advantage. They occupied the majority of the seats in the parliament, and the results of this vote would naturally not be beneficial to the new nobles. After all these years of hard work, the new nobles had made little progress. Now that they saw the power of the Gray Coat Army, coupled with this great opportunity, they naturally would not let it go. Once the 2 parties succeeded, the votes of the Gray Coat Army would naturally be equivalent to the votes of the new nobles, and this would undoubtedly increase their speaking rights. Of course, the premise of these beautiful prospects was that the Gray Coat Army had to agree to disband the army. That's their foundation, and it's too difficult. Forgive me, but I can't think of any way. Yes, and to put it bluntly, they might not completely trust us. They don't dare to disband the army at all. Did His Highness say that this idea can be compromised? It's difficult. This is the bargaining chip for His Highness to manipulate the 3 votes in the parliament. If we compromise, I'm afraid it will be difficult for His Highness. Everyone, looking at the nobles who kept shaking their heads, Ronald pinched the bridge of his nose. No matter what, we have to test them first. At least we have to know where their bottom line is. That's true. The middle-aged noble nodded. It's impossible to get them to agree after thinking about it once. We have to at least come up with some results and report to His Highness so that the people on the other side can discuss countermeasures. Yes, that's right. But these old worms are watching too closely. How should we communicate with them? There's always a way. They can't be so inseparable, right? That's really hard to say. This was indeed a problem. The traditional nobles naturally could not allow the new nobles to cooperate with the Gray Coat Army, so they would definitely be on their guard. After discussing for a while, the younger noble's eyes suddenly lit up, and he raised his head and said, "I have an idea. How about we let Philip do it? He moves freely and does not attract attention, and he seems to be related to the Gray Coat Army." That's right. After all, Philip is one of us. That's a good idea. But Speaking of which, is he reliable? All right, that's a problem. Sigh. Everyone was conflicted, and letting Philip convey the message was undoubtedly the best way. But to be honest, they really did not trust Philip. In the end, it was Ronald who stood up and made the decision. Forget it. Let's give it a try. Let him convey some information first. And if it works, we'll pin our hopes on him. That's the only way. God of light bless. Chapter 423. In the afternoon, while Ronald and the group of new nobles were discussing countermeasures, a conspiracy was also in progress. On a remote street in the Western District, a sealed ordinary carriage was parked on the side of the road. In fact, since the carriage arrived an hour ago, it had been parked there quietly. However, because there were no passers-by, it did not seem out of place. After a while, an honest-looking young man suddenly appeared at the entrance of the alley, not far away. Then, he quickly scanned the surroundings with his agile eyes that did not match his appearance. He seemed very vigilant. After confirming that there was no danger around, the young man took a few steps forward and quickly stepped on the carriage. The door opened slightly, and he jumped in. This scene happened very quickly, at most about 3 seconds, so it did not attract anyone's attention. In the carriage, in addition to the young man who just came in, there was also a middle-aged man with a teacup and eyes slightly closed. This person was familiar to Tang, In, and Josiah. He was a high-ranking member of the secret organization, Enoch, who withdrew from the tavern at noon first. The carriage fell into silence. Only the curling smoke from the teacup and the slight sound of Enoch sipping tea could be heard. The honest-looking young man was very patient. He waited until Enoch, who had a face full of enjoyment, finished his tea and put down the teacup before he bowed and said, "Sir, it's done." Enoch opened his eyes and said flatly, "Oh, tell me about it." "Sir, you have a good foresight. When we withdrew from the tavern today, there was indeed a group of people who had their eyes on us." Enoch nodded with a smile and then asked, "Did Tang, In, and Josiah notice it?" "No." The young man shook his head. Tang In and the others were still in the tavern at that time. After I found those people outside, I intercepted them first. "You made a move?" Enoch noticed that the young man's left hand was a little unnatural and asked with a frown. The young man did not deny it. "We just exchanged 2 moves at the beginning. It's nothing." "Well, they're very strong. I'm no match for them." "Haha, it's good that they're strong. I'm just afraid that they're not strong enough." Enoch smiled and sighed. He tapped on the wall of the car and continued to ask, and then, "They are very interested in the cooperation we proposed, but I don't think they are the ones in charge. They only said that they would pass on my message and asked me to meet again tonight." "All right." Enoch clapped his hands and smiled, patting the young man's shoulder approvingly. "You're indeed worthy of the effort I put in to get you to join the secret organization. You really didn't disappoint me. Don't worry, if this matter succeeds, you will be rewarded handsomely." "Thank you, my lord." The young man's eyes were filled with joy as he bowed again. The greedy look on his face was clearly visible. Enoch's eyes flickered when he saw this. Then, he immediately put away the scroll and said with a serious expression, "I will create an opportunity for you tonight. You must get the map. Remember, be careful in everything you do. Well, especially pay attention to Tang In. That person is too vigilant. The slightest flaw will be seen through." "Don't worry, my lord. I won't dare to be careless." "That's the best." Enoch nodded and smiled, "But don't be too cautious. I still believe in your skills, and you didn't expose your identity. It's the most appropriate thing to do. There's still some time. Come, I know you like to drink. Drink a few cups as a celebration of success. Oh, this is tea. Wait for me to find a bottle of wine." Enoch took out another cup. His hand was about to touch the teapot when he paused. He patted his forehead, shook his head, and laughed. Then, he found a slender crystal bottle with a beautiful packaging behind him. The name of the wine is Ice Flame Volcano. He raised the wine bottle. Against the crystal wall, the blue liquid inside tumbled and flowed, just like the azure sea. Enoch said proudly, "I don't like to drink, but I like to collect things. I got this from an auction when I was still a noble a few years ago. What was the price at that time? Well, 18,000 gold coins. 18,000 gold coins. The young man opened his mouth and looked at the small crystal bottle in shock. Then he came back to his senses and his face was full of fear. How can I do this? I don't deserve to taste such a precious thing. Haha, I said you deserve it. And since it's wine, you have to drink it. Enoch took out a small knife and removed the cork on the bottle. With a pop sound, a strange aroma instantly filled the carriage. The young man's throat rolled, and he swallowed his saliva with difficulty. Then I won't be polite. I want you to be polite. Come, cheers. Enoch poured the wine and handed one of the cups to the young man. Then he raised his cup and said in a bold and unrestrained manner. The young man was flattered and took the cup with both hands. With a pleasant sound, he couldn't wait to drink it. TSK, 18,000 gold coins. It's really good wine. The young man was young, but it seemed to be an excellent cup of wine. He closed his eyes and drank it with a face full of enjoyment. Enoch didn't seem to be good at drinking, but after drinking one cup, his face was already a little red. Hearing the young man's words, he smiled and directly pushed the bottle of wine over. In that case, this bottle of wine is for you. I still prefer to drink tea. The young man really liked this thing, so he didn't refuse and poured another cup. Thank you, sir. Then, I hope that you can take over the secret organization after this matter. Haha, I like what you said. There were no outsiders here. Enoch finally revealed his ambition to take charge of the secret organization. He raised his head and drank the tea. TSK. It's not that I want to say this, but the position of the leader of the secret organization should be yours. That Josiah is just a little girl. If it weren't for your help, how could the secret organization reach this point? TSK. I don't care about the position of the leader of the secret organization, but I must take the power of intelligence in my hands. After a pause, Enoch's face showed anger. Hateful Tang In, that little brat, repeatedly ruined my great cause. Yes, it's that Tang In who always comes to mess things up. But don't worry, sir. They will definitely die in the hands of those people tomorrow night. As the saying goes, one must be soft-hearted when one drinks from others. In addition, this young man was originally Enoch's subordinate, so he naturally shared the same hatred and anger. It's difficult. Josiah is still possible, but Tang In. Enoch shook his head with a slight bitterness in the corner of his mouth. His strength is too strong. Those Earth Stage warriors couldn't kill him before, so it's unlikely that these people can kill him. Well, you go over to meet them tonight and tell them about Josiah's strength. As for Tang In, just say that he's powerful. Don't scare them away. Well, as long as Josiah is dead, our goal will be achieved. I understand. Enoch nodded and said casually, well, continue drinking. By the way, this wine is called Volcano. It's very strong and quite intoxicating. You can drink half a bottle, so as not to mess up the important matter. It's not too late for you and I to taste the remaining half bottle together after we succeed. Okay, I'll listen to you, sir. Please, sir, let me toast you again. Good. At night in the Sherwan Mountains. The bonfire was lit, and the moon was dim. After Josiah and the noble negotiation team quarreled for half a day, the two opposing armies also had a small conflict. Of course, it was said to be a small conflict, but in this environment where nearly 200,000 soldiers were gathered, any small conflict could become the direct fuse of a tragic war. In the temporary camp of the Gray Coat Army, in the main tent, the atmosphere was very gloomy. Rosa, Old Marshal Omeng, Bosco, and a few other ministers who came with the army gathered here. Among them, Rosa's face was solemn and a little angry. Omeng was completely gloomy and angry. Bosco was expressionless, so no one could tell what he was thinking. The other ministers were a little complicated. Some of them crossed their arms and had a knowing look on their faces, while others obviously didn't think much of it. Whoosh. The curtain of the tent opened, and a young officer in armor walked in. It was Borg. Feeling the suffocating atmosphere in the tent, he didn't dare to say anything. He took 2 steps forward and bowed directly. Leader, the matter has been investigated clearly. Rosa was expressionless. Speak. Yes. Borg didn't dare to delay and quickly said, "The commander of the 4th Army's 2nd Division Swordsman Regiment, Gory, led a battalion of soldiers without permission and annihilated 3 of the Brand's patrol long spear brigades. Then, when he killed his way to the Brand's camp, he was discovered by my scouts. He has been captured and is now outside the tent. Also, right now, the Brand general is shouting outside the camp and asking for him." After he finished speaking, the tent fell into silence again. Omeng slammed his palm down. There was a look of anger on his face, but there was also a trace of reluctance. The ministers looked at each other and shook their heads slightly. They were all frowning. Then, all eyes were focused on Rosa. The expression on Rosa's face still didn't change, but no one knew if there was a storm in his heart. After a while, he suddenly closed his eyes and sighed softly. He said, "Who made the first move?" Borg hesitated for a moment, then gritted his teeth and said, "It was Gory." As if he wasn't surprised, Rosa continued to ask why. "I don't know." I asked, but he didn't want to say. Nodding his head, Rosa pondered for a while and lowered his eyes. "Bring him in." "Yes." Borg bowed and left. In less than 10 seconds, he walked in again with a middle-aged man with his hands tied. There was no doubt that this was Gory. "Untie him and sit." Hearing this, Borg first untied the rope, then moved a chair and placed it behind Gory. However, Gory didn't sit down. He just stood there with his head lowered. Rosa got up and walked around the table to Gory. He stared at him for a moment. Neither of them spoke. Gory seemed to want to see a flower in his military boots. He didn't raise his head, but some sweat still seeped out from his temples and spread out along his hair. "I remember you," Rosa suddenly said. "You joined the Gray Coat Army 6 years ago, right? I remember that you had an old mother and 2 brothers at that time. How are they now?" Gory was still silent. The sweat on his forehead slid down to the tip of his nose, hanging there without falling. "Why? Why did you privately lead troops to attack? Are you dissatisfied with my decision? Do you think I'm cowardly and don't dare to attack the city? Or do you want to prove something? Prove that you are very powerful. A battalion destroyed 3 brigades of the enemy and fearlessly charged towards tens of thousands of people. Prove to us that the enemy is very weak, so weak that we can easily defeat them. So we should attack the city." "Gory!" Rosa suddenly roared, shaking Gory and everyone else in the room. "Answer me. Why?" "Because my 2 brothers died in their hands. Because I want revenge. I want to kill them all. Kill them all." Gory suddenly took a step back and knocked the chair away. He waved his hands and roared. His eyes were red, and his killing intent was overflowing. After roaring dozens of times, his voice was hoarse like a dying beast. His voice stopped, but the sound of thunder still echoed in the ears of everyone in the tent for a long time. Borg, who retreated to the door, saw this and frowned. His eyes stared at Gory, who seemed to have lost his mind. He bent his body slightly and took 2 steps forward. However, as Rosa waved his hand, he silently stepped back. "Revenge, revenge again," Rosa murmured. His expression was a little gloomy, and a mocking and bitter smile appeared on his lips. It seemed to be mocking this reason, but also seemed to be discouraged by himself. Taking a deep breath, Rosa slightly recovered his wooden expression, and his tone was a little bleak. "Since the establishment of the Gray Coat Army, hundreds of thousands of people have died and been injured. Your brother died, and you want revenge. Other people's brothers, other people's relatives and brothers died. Do you want revenge too? What about the civilians of the world? They are humiliated and oppressed every moment. Who will avenge them? Killing, killing, killing. Then what's the point of the damn Gray Coat Army?" The last sentence was roared. His voice was a little shrill. It was not as imposing as Gory's, but it did make everyone's heart tremble. They had not seen Rosa curse for a long time, and there were only a few times in their memory. "You only know how to take revenge. You only know how to fight your way into the city. You only know how to King vent. Have you thought about what to do in the future? You don't care about revenge, but have you ever thought about those who follow us? What will they think? You have the ability to take revenge, but who will give them a stable life? Do we rely on this kind of endless slaughter? You don't understand. You don't understand. You don't understand. At the end, Rose's eyes were slightly red, his eyelids drooped, and his tone gradually became hoarse and low. He seemed to be a little tired. The Greycoat army was constantly growing, and more people came to join them. They might just come with a beautiful future. But when it came to Rosa, it became a mountain of pressure. For more than 10 years, she had never lacked perseverance to bear all this, and she had never exposed this pressure. But not expressing it did not mean that she did not care. On the contrary, as a leader, she would only consider more and bear more. Now, this short outburst undoubtedly meant something. Except for Bosco, all the ministers were shocked when they heard this. Rosa's words were directed at Gory, but they were also directed at them. After all, ever since the army stopped stationing, they had been looking for Rosa many times every day for this matter. Your two brothers died on the battlefield, and they're the heroes of the Greycoat army. In the future, they will also be heroes in the hearts of many civilians. But unfortunately, you are not. After the outburst, Rosa's expression returned to calmness. After saying this, he turned and walked back to his seat. Gory was still silent, and a trace of guilt flashed across his face. His lips moved as if he wanted to say something, but in the end, he just lowered his head even more. After sitting back, Rosa pursed his lips, turned his head, and asked, "Old Marshal, according to the military rules, how should we deal with you for taking troops out of the camp to fight without permission?" Omeng looked at Gory and said in a deep voice, "According to the military rules, you should be beheaded." Leader. Several ministers heard this and trembled and spoke at the same time. Rosa glanced at them and said calmly, "Do you have any doubts?" Several ministers looked at each other, and there was a difficult expression on their faces. Gory was considered an old man in the Greycoat army, and he knew a lot of them. Seeing that he was in trouble, it was not right for them not to help. Moreover, Rosa's Greycoat army had been established for so many years, and there had never been a senior general who died under the military rules. Now that they had spoken, they were also afraid of hurting the hearts of the other generals. Bosco glanced at his colleagues with some disdain, and then sighed and said, "Leader, Gory violated the military rules, and there is no doubt that he should be punished according to the crime. But now that the enemy is in front of us, why don't we slow down and let him redeem himself?" As soon as his voice fell, Gory, who had been silent, suddenly bent his knees and bowed to everyone present. He then stood up and said, "This is my fault, and I am willing to accept the military law." Sigh. Bosco was stunned for a moment, then shook his head and sighed. In fact, it was not a pity. He was not familiar with Gory, and what he said before was not wrong. Whether Gory was punished by the military law or not, he could still get a good reputation. Good. Rosa nodded solemnly. He then looked into Gory's eyes and said in a low voice, "Your old mother will arrange everything properly. After we go back, I will go and tell her everything. Guards, drag him out and behead him." "Thank you, leader." Gory regained his calm and bowed again, then turned and walked out of the tent with the two soldiers. The tent was quiet again. After a while, Rosa waved his hand tiredly and said, "Everyone is dismissed. Old Marshal, regarding the military matters, please appease the soldiers of Gory's regiment." "Rest assured, leader." Omeng stood up and nodded solemnly. "Leader." Borg suddenly called out from the door and said hesitantly, "What about the brand general who was shouting at the entrance of the station? What about him?" Everyone stopped in their tracks. Yes, the brand general who was asking for the murderer was still outside. Although they were opponents in war, there was no murderer. But now was the time for negotiation, and this time they were indeed in the wrong, so they had to give an explanation. But what should they do now? They had killed him. Should they give his body to them? Rosa seemed to have seen through everyone's thoughts. He put his hand on his forehead and said indifferently, "I can't give our people to the enemy, whether they are alive or dead." So, he suddenly looked up, his face was cold, and said word by word, "Let them get out." Yes. Chapter 425. regardless of whether it was from the standpoint of both sides or from the many years of enmity between them. This negotiation between the Bran Empire and the Grey Coat Army was destined to be difficult in the dark. Therefore, even though the noble negotiation team had previously found a suitable excuse to stay in Mountain Stream City for a while. However, everyone knew that such a negotiation would definitely take a lot of time. Therefore, only one day after the first negotiation, the second negotiation came at noon the next day. This time, the location of the negotiation was not at the place Josiah and the others had found, but at the place chosen by the other party. Once for each side, it was very fair, wasn't it? Of course, the most important thing was that the nobles could no longer tolerate negotiating in a dilapidated environment with grease and dust on the table. This was completely not in line with their status and would affect their performance. Just after noon, Josiah and the others arrived at the negotiation location. In the center of the city, the most high-end tavern, which was also the place where Philip had brought Tang on and Josiah 2 days ago. Needless to say, the entire tavern was booked. After Tang, In, and the others alighted, they looked at their ordinary carriage and then at the magnificent tavern door at the side and grinned. It was really eye-catching. This time, the scene of the meeting was more harmonious. Josiah and the others did not have any intention of putting on a show of strength at all, and Ronald and the others were now in need of help, so they politely went out to welcome them personally. As for Simpson and the other traditional nobles, they did not appear. It was probably because of yesterday's embarrassing battle and the fainting of their leader at the end, so they really did not have the mood to do these superficial things. The tavern was sealed off, but the waiters and waiters inside were naturally still there. When they saw Tang, In, Josiah, and the others enter, they stopped what they were doing and opened their mouths. Of course, they were not shocked by these plainly dressed men and women, or at least not at first. What made them shocked and even absurd was that the dozen or so great nobles who had booked their entire high-end tavern, whom they could only look up to in this lifetime, were now scattered to the side. The arc of their footsteps gave them the illusion that they were the moon surrounded by a myriad of stars. The degree of being needed determined the value. If they saw Josiah and the others under normal circumstances, Ronald and the others wouldn't hesitate to cast a glance at them. However, things were naturally different now. In their eyes, Josiah and the others had become 3 votes that they relied on to seize greater authority in the parliament. Of course, it would only be clearer in the eyes of a bystander. Josiah and the others did not have such a feeling. They just came in together, that's all. Tang, In, and Josiah had been to this tavern before, but they were now led in a completely different direction. After passing through the 2-story tavern loft facing the street, it suddenly opened up to a bright and elegant courtyard at the back. Although it was called a courtyard, it looked more like a garden. Among them, there were innumerable exotic flowers and trees, all of which displayed their own impressive postures. There were a few narrow paths paved with white jade that led into the flowering shrubs. At the end of the path, there were a few individual exquisite houses. He didn't know if it was a clever design or because of magic, but he couldn't feel the ubiquitous cold wind here. Only a faint fragrance lingered around his nose. The impact of such a pleasing scenery was undoubtedly huge, especially for the commoners who had never seen such a scene before. After arriving here, Josiah and Enoch were fine. After all, they used to be nobles. They were a little surprised, but more than that, they admired it. However, Dave and the others were a little embarrassed. Although their expressions didn't change, it could be seen that they were trying their best to maintain it. In fact, it would be a problem if one's expression didn't change when they came here for the first time. For example, Tang In looked at the scenery that fluctuated between high and low. He sighed in his heart. What a good place for an assassination. Ronald could naturally see that Dave and the others were a little nervous. He curled his lips slightly and didn't look at them too impolitely. He extended his hand and led them to a small path. Please. Then he pointed to the exquisite house at the end of the path. This is the VIP area of the tavern. The environment is quiet and you won't be disturbed. It's appropriate to use this place to welcome you. And it's also the place where we'll be negotiating today. Thank you, Sir Ronald. Josiah nodded to show that she understood. Since the other party had vaguely shown goodwill, she naturally wouldn't treat him coldly. The small path wasn't long. They reached the middle of the path as they spoke. Suddenly, Tang squinted his long and narrow eyes. He put his left hand on Josiah's shoulder, and the dagger in his right hand shone brightly. Bang, bang, bang. Josiah stopped in her tracks. She was about to turn around in surprise when she heard a few strange sounds. Then she saw a few large flower shadows suddenly soar into the sky from the flower bushes on the path. It looked like a bamboo basket. Before she could react, whoosh, whoosh, whoosh. Another long arrow whistled and pierced the sky. However, the target wasn't the people on the ground, but the flower shadows in the sky. Puff, puff, puff. Hua, hua, hua. The flower shadows shattered, leaving behind a colorful world. It sounded complicated, but in fact, all the actions happened in an instant. Other than a few people, everyone stared blankly at the sky. Those falling flower petals. That's right. After a lot of work, what fell in the end wasn't any hidden weapon, but flower petals. Red, white, yellow, purple. Under the warm light, petals of all kinds of colors fell from the sky. It was like a dreamy petal rain, exceptionally magnificent. At this moment, a figure walked out from behind a tree at the corner of the path. A well-ironed black tuxedo, with a large bouquet of bright and juicy roses covering the chest. Damn, I always felt that something was missing. So was this guy? The corner of Tang's eyes twitched. He put away the dagger and held his forehead, unable to look directly. That's right, the person who made the flower rain and held the flowers in his hands was Philip. At first, Tang didn't see him in front of the tavern and was a little surprised. He thought that he was shocked by Josiah's indifference yesterday. He didn't expect him to be waiting here. To be honest, Tang couldn't bear to see the next scene. Tang didn't know whether Josiah liked Philip or not. But Tang knew that when Josiah was serious about something, he would never consider such things, of course. Only Tang had this thought. After all, he was too familiar with Josiah. When the others saw the flamboyantly dressed Philip walking over affectionately, they were a little stunned. That was the truth. Philip's move was too beautiful. They believed that no woman would refuse. Wait, woman. Everyone instantly came back to their senses and focused their attention on Josiah. There was no other way. She was the only woman present. The nobles' minds were in a mess. Of course, they knew Philip's character. The title of the kingdom's flower wolf was not fake. It could be said that since this guy came of age, thousands of women in the capital had fallen for him. It was strange. As his name became more and more famous, the women in the capital knew that there was no future with him, but they were still willing to throw themselves into his arms like moths to a flame. It was impossible for the nobles not to be jealous. It had nothing to do with age. It was only related to the word man. But they had to admit that this guy was good with women and not just good at it. But when did this guy's taste become so heavy? Could it be that he was so hungry that he couldn't be picky? With such an impression, it was naturally because Joshua's current image did not match that of a beautiful woman. Originally, although there was a saying that one shouldn't judge a book by its cover in another world, reality proved that no matter where it was, this saying that was often on the lips of men was usually just for show. Of course, Dave and the rest didn't think so. When they came back to their senses, they saw Philip walking over leisurely. Their hearts were filled with anger, and they couldn't wait to throw him to the ground and use their shoes to measure the length of this guy's face. However, all these thoughts couldn't stop Philip from coming in front of Josiah. His eyes met with the clear eyes of Josiah. He held up the flowers and said in a gentle voice, "Please forgive my presumptuousness. I don't have any other intentions. I just hope that you can forgive my foolish behavior." He's really good at picking up girls. Tang smacked his lips. Putting on such a big show just to apologize, normal women would definitely let down their guard and agree. But if he wanted to apologize, would he need to give roses? But at this time, Tang could only think like Dave and the rest. It wasn't appropriate for him to remind them. First of all, this was a matter between the two of them. Moreover, there were outsiders here. Josiah was the person in charge of this negotiation. It was hard to say what would happen if he suddenly went forward, but it was hard to say whether Ronald and the rest wouldn't look down on him. Dump him, dump him. This was what Dave and the rest were shouting in their hearts. Accept. This was what Ronald and the rest were thinking now. It wasn't for the sake of Philip, but purely for the sake of the new nobles. After all, if Philip could really take down the person in charge of this negotiation, it would only be beneficial to their plan. At this moment, Josiah avoided Philip's gaze, stretched out his hand, and patted the petals off his shoulder. With a calm face, he turned his head and asked, "Sir Ronald, is the negotiation about to begin?" Looking at the other party's still clear eyes, Ronald was stunned for a moment. Then he reacted and sighed regretfully in his heart. He stretched out his hand and gestured. "Yes, this way, please." Nodding, Josiah acted as if he didn't see Philip and Red Rose in front of him, and walked straight past them with Ronald. As expected, Tangen's lips curled up slightly. Although he had expected this, he didn't know why, but he was still in a particularly good mood now. When he saw Philip's stupefied face again, he hurriedly adjusted his expression. After all, they were friends, weren't they? He took 2 steps forward and patted Philip's shoulder, which was like a piece of deadwood. Alas, with a long sigh, he passed by. Behind him, Dave and the rest followed suit. With a gloating smile on their faces, they patted Philip's shoulder with force. Alas, if Tangen's long sigh was somewhat mournful, then they were simply stabbing a knife into the wound. After a few long sighs, the crowd of nobles stepped forward. They didn't do that. They just looked at Philip and the petals on the ground with a strange expression, and then walked away. The invincible flower wolf of the kingdom had actually failed, and such a woman. This world was too crazy. Chapter 426. Just like how no matter which world people were from, they loved to watch the plot of a loser's counterattack. She believed that there was nothing more delightful and resonant than seeing the tall, rich, and handsome man end up in a sorry state. It should be said that Philip's life was tragic. Creating a sea of flowers, showy styling, and other fantastic ideas must have cost him a lot of brain cells and used a lot of manpower to finally achieve such a shocking result. But just like a classic saying, you can guess the beginning, but you can't guess the ending. In the end, all that was left was a lonely and desolate figure in the midst of the withered flowers, alone and messy. As for the reason for the tragedy, it was actually easy to understand. If it was summed up in one sentence, it would be, at the wrong time, using the right method but with the wrong person. After skipping the episode with Philip, everyone finally arrived at the location of the negotiation, which was the exquisite little house. In fact, the so-called negotiation was a group of people with different intentions gathering together. For certain interests, they would use methods such as cursing, throwing shoes, and even fighting to reach a certain level of agreement or compromise. Now, the first negotiation between the secret organization and the noble negotiation team had ended. Although the beginning was bad and the situation was very tense, it ended in nothing. But no matter what, both sides had tested each other. Both sides had left a deep impression on each other. If they went according to the normal process, then the second negotiation would enter the substantive stage. After all, there was not much time left for the negotiation. But there were always exceptions, such as, "Oh, you're here? I'm glad you know how to be punctual, although I really don't want to see you. Look at the environment here. This is called a negotiation. Do country bumpkins understand? Be careful. This is for your own good, because you can't afford to pay for the things here." As soon as the door opened, sarcastic and mean words came almost at the same time. Naturally, the group of traditional nobles was sitting inside. They were still persistently harassing and destroying things. And they seemed to feel that they were in their home ground, which gave them a little more confidence to insult others. Josiah frowned and looked up to see Simpson's old face. He pursed his lips. "Just as you said just now, I also don't want to see you. But I'm still happy to see Sir Simpson. Well, I feel less guilty about killing people. You?" His old face instantly flushed red, and his eyes widened like copper bells, as if he wanted to devour someone. Yesterday's embarrassing fall was undoubtedly a humiliating memory for Simpson. Now, Josiah's words were like sprinkling salt on the wound, and he reacted instantly. The two nobles sitting next to Simpson leaned against his back at the same time, probably worried that yesterday's incident would repeat itself. They kept reminding and comforting him. In the end, Simpson snorted coldly and turned his head away, putting on a look of disdain. After hitting the nail on the head, Josiah did not have the time to deal with these troublemakers. He looked around and found the location of his side. This exquisite house didn't look big from the outside, but after entering, one would find that the space inside was not small. Just like this negotiation hall, even if dozens of people sat down, it would still be more than enough. After all, it was the best tavern in Mountain Stream City. The environment inside didn't need to be described in detail to know that it was extremely gorgeous. The seating conditions and other objective conditions were not difficult. After all, everything was arranged by the new nobles. They wouldn't embarrass Josiah and the others in such an obvious place. Of course, the reason why they chose such a luxurious place was not without the intention of using the environment to pressure them. In fact, they did it. Dave and the others sat on the goose-down chairs and leaned on the gold-threaded Janonwood table. Even though they were constantly adjusting, it was a little unnatural, and they felt a little restrained. There was nothing they could do about it. It was rare to see someone with a big heart who could ignore any situation. When a person reached a place that did not match their level, it was inevitable that they would feel a little depressed. Just like the nobles in the ordinary tavern, Dave and the others were in a similar state of mind. Tang In and Josiah looked at each other, feeling a little helpless. This kind of psychological pressure could only be overcome by habit. It was difficult for outsiders to help. The nobles could naturally see this, but of course, they wouldn't kindly remind them. Instead, they quickly entered the formal negotiations. Although the new nobles were prepared for private negotiations, there were some conditions that could be discussed face to face. In addition to the excellent opportunity in front of them, there was no reason for them to let it go. First of all, there was no need to think about dividing the nobles' land. Not to mention the new nobles, even the king of Bran, might not dare to agree to this condition. This was because the empire was essentially maintained by the nobles. If the fundamental interests of the nobles were affected, the empire would collapse. Therefore, at the beginning, they talked about the possibility of letting the commoner children enter the academy. Ronald and the others had already decided on this. However, since it was a negotiation, they naturally couldn't reveal their trump card at the beginning. After all, as long as the negotiation went well, it would give the other party a feeling that it was not easy to come by, and they might even feel grateful. This way, there would be room for discussion about other conditions. Moreover, there were still many ways to go about it. For example, who would pay for the construction of these academies, and so on. However, seeing that the negotiations were in progress, the traditional nobles were not happy. They would nitpick on the external factors and ridicule them. Then, they would join in on the negotiations and cause trouble. Such behavior was undoubtedly detestable. Not only Twain, Josiah, and the rest, but even Ronald and the other new nobles were frowning, wishing they could stuff their mouths with a rag. In fact, Josiah and the others also had a division of labor when they came. This was the second formal negotiation, so naturally, it would not turn into a war of words like the last time. Therefore, a few people participated in the negotiations, and a few people dealt with the disturbances and so on. However, as the saying goes, plans could not keep up with changes. Who would have thought that this negotiation would be arranged in such an environment? This caused Dave and the others to lose a lot of their standards and their combat power to drop sharply. It seemed that they could not count on them anymore. As they were losing ground, Tang In had no choice but to roll up his sleeves and personally participate in the battle. At this moment, the waiter knocked on the door and served cups of tea with a faint aroma. Simpson rolled his eyes and picked up the teacup again and said sarcastically, "Have a taste. This may be the most expensive thing you've ever drunk in your life." Haha, I was really worried about you. After drinking this, how are you going to swallow your usual swill? Tang In pursed his lips. Oh, if I remember correctly, Sir Simpson drank quite a few cups of tea at our place yesterday. Haha, if that's swill, I really don't know what to call you. Well, is it a pig or a pig? A pig? What do you mean by a pig? A certain noble who liked to think immediately jumped into the trap. He looked up at Simpson, whose face was red with anger, and immediately shrank back. Ha! My dear friend, you're really experienced and knowledgeable. Great minds think alike. Hey, I didn't say that. With Tang Yin's participation, the battle became unprecedentedly intense. To be honest, Simpson and the others really did not have much of an impression of Tang Yin. They only knew that there was such a person. After all, during the first negotiation, the other party was so quiet. Who would have thought that he would jump out now? And he was very fierce. His words were especially sharp, and every sentence made people want to vomit blood. The battle escalated quickly. After Simpson was so angry that he was stamping with rage and speaking incoherently, the battle of attrition began to become the mainstream. Tang Yin was not afraid either. What kind of derogatory words had he not heard in the modern world, such as lacking in virtue and digging up ancestral graves? Now, he flipped through them one by one. There were no vulgarities, but they were focused on personal attacks. It was as if he was having a war of words with a group of scholars. As he scolded, the topic became more and more off-topic. In the end, he simply changed the topic and greeted them one by one. Simpson and the others were furious, but their cultivation as nobles and the environment they usually came into contact with really made them lack the words to scold others. They only used the same few words over and over again. It was really lacking in novelty. Since they could not gain an advantage verbally, they were naturally suppressing the anger in their hearts. In the end, when Tang Yin said, "Your mother said that I'm better than you and your father in bed," it successfully made one of the nobles think for 10 seconds. Then, he roared, lost his rationality, took off his boots, and threw them at Tang Yin. A war of words was fine, no matter how unpleasant it was, but the premise was that they did not fight. How could Tang Yin let go of this opportunity? He took the boots and sent them back the way they came. But of course, the strength was different. He directly knocked the noble unconscious and successfully eliminated an opponent. As a result, the scene became even more chaotic. Chapter 427. Met with rush hour on the way back, just got home. Well, I'll write a chapter first. From tomorrow onwards, the updates will be back to normal. Oh no, it's going to explode. In the evening, at the entrance of the tavern. Sir, I'll stop here. Thank you for your hospitality today. It's my pleasure. Well, please consider our proposal. In short, we are sincere in cooperating with you. Sir, don't worry. Well, by the way, our people have offended you today. Sir Simpson, is there any problem? The harmonious farewell scene suddenly stagnated. Whether it was the new nobles or Dave and the others, they all unconsciously turned to look at a certain guy with a dull expression. Their expressions were a little strange. No matter what, there are no casualties. The problem should not be big. Using casualties as a measure of the problem, and the target was the nobles, Ronald felt that his words were not very confident. He hesitated for a while before answering vaguely in the end. Obviously, this issue was not suitable to be discussed in depth. The new nobles did not have a good impression of Simpson's group. Just now, when they saw the other party fall into a state of hysteria, unconscious and dumbfounded, they were a little gloating in their hearts. But when they remembered that the young man named Arthur who caused this effect was their negotiation partner, they naturally felt a lot of pressure in their hearts. At this point, the scene was a little strange. Fortunately, it was now close to parting. After Josiah and Ronald exchanged a few pleasantries, they tacitly left on their carriages. The tavern where the negotiation was held was in the center of the city. Although it was evening, the flow of people still did not decrease. Since there were many eyes, it was naturally not easy to evacuate secretly. However, Tang In and the others had already considered this problem. So as soon as they got on the carriages, several carriages went to the square in the city at the same time. Then, they crossed each other and left in different directions. Tang In was naturally with Josiah. After changing carriages several times and going around in circles, the two got on Elder Ba's carriage, which had been waiting for a long time. After a while, the curtain was lowered, and Tang In turned to Josiah and said, "Okay, it's safe." Then, he opened the front door. "Elder Ba, follow the route we previously planned. Well, pay attention to the surroundings." "All right, don't worry, I used to be a scout." "Giddy up." Inside the carriage, the slightly tired Josiah rubbed his eyes, and then said with some joy, "Building an independent commoners academy, a small-scale tax reduction experiment. Haha, today's not bad. I've finally gained something." Pausing for a moment, he tilted his head and frowned out of habit. "But I still find it a little strange. Even though there are some discounts, but the other party seems to be deliberately trying to curry favor with us. Do they have some conditions?" "There should be." Gulp. Tang In picked up the teapot and gulped down a mouthful of tea. His voice was a little hoarse. "I came out once midway and saw Philip. Well, he was not in good spirits, but he still asked me for the contact location of the secret organization. He probably wanted to be a mouthpiece." The Riverside Tavern was an important stronghold of the secret organization in Mountain Stream City. In order to prevent them from being wiped out or not having a foothold when they moved, they had set up several other secondary points of contact in the city. This could be found in other cities as well. The only difference was the quantity. "I see." Josiah did not care about Philip's state and nodded after hearing Tang In's words. This time, the members of the noble negotiation team were obviously on opposite sides. It was really inconvenient for the new noble to do anything. And Philip, as someone who knew both sides and did not attract attention, was naturally the best choice to pass on the message through him. After figuring this out, Josiah's previous joy immediately subsided. Obviously, the negotiation this time had not reached the real, substantive stage. Then, as if thinking of something, he stole a glance at Tang In, covered his mouth, and chuckled. "That's right. Tang, your performance today. Haha, it's very impressive." After being with Tang In for a long time, Josiah was used to using these strange modern words. Waving his hand, Tang In picked up the teapot again with a look of indifference. "Didn't I get pushed to the edge? Cough, cough, gulp. My throat is spitting fire. Hey, I'm usually very humble." "Pushed to the edge, humble." Josiah grinned, and his clear eyes widened, as if he was listening to a fantasy story. How could Simpson and the others, who were so angry that they were about to vomit blood, endure this? The carriage passed through the bustling streets at a moderate speed. The surrounding buildings gradually changed from a forest of shops to rows of low houses. There were only a few oil lamps, and no pedestrians could be seen. It was somewhat remote and desolate. It was undoubtedly much more difficult to follow in such an environment. So, Elder Ba, who was in front of the carriage, tightened the reins and gradually increased the speed. In the carriage, Tang In met with Josiah's stunned gaze. After a moment, he smacked his lips and put down the teapot. "Don't look at me like that. You can't worship me, and don't be so infatuated with me. Am I really just a legend? HM?" Before he finished speaking, Tang In's body suddenly stiffened. The lazy expression disappeared in an instant. His long and narrow eyes narrowed slightly, and a blade-like light shone in them. At this moment, Hiss, the panicked horse, neighed, and the carriage leaned forward as if it had tripped over something. Then there was a roar. "Be careful!" Whoosh, whoosh, whoosh. The bowstring vibrated, and the sharp arrow whistled. Everything happened in an instant. Tang In, who was in the carriage, relied on his sensitivity to danger to sense that something was wrong. Although Elder Ba was a little weak in this aspect, he was a scout and had an almost instinctive sense of the surrounding environment. Usually, the two of them would be able to see something from dozens of meters away. But this time, it was a little too late. The reason was very simple. Whether it was Tang In or Elder Ba, they had placed their attention behind them to see if anyone was following them. But this time, it was more like someone was lying in ambush, waiting for them to fall into a trap. Bang, bang, bang. The horse fell, and the broken wood flew everywhere. Sharp arrows came from all directions at the same time. The thin walls of the carriage could not withstand a single blow and were shattered in an instant. After a round of arrow rain, there was a pause for less than a second. In the flickering light, the arrows quickly changed direction. Thud, thud, thud. The arrows fell on the limestone floor, making a dense explosion sound like beans being fried. Some of the arrows shot to the front of the carriage, where Elderbot jumped out from the carriage's momentum and rolled on the ground. Most of the arrows were shot towards the back of the carriage, because there was a figure rolling on the ground a few times before quickly getting up. His figure was like a ghost as he dodged and evaded the whistling arrows without delay. Needless to say, it was Tang Yin, or more accurately, it was Tang Yin, who was carrying Josiah from the bottom of the carriage and out of the range of the first round of arrow rain. With a cold gaze, Tang Yin quickly locked his gaze on the dozens of figures holding bows on the surrounding roofs while avoiding the arrows. Then his eyelids suddenly twitched, and he shouted, "Go! Go! Go!" Obviously, this sentence was directed at Elder Ba, because after the arrow rain failed, the arrows that came after were a little strange. Boom, boom, boom. When the arrows hit the ground, it was like a barrel of gunpowder that ignited the fuse in an instant. The flames soared into the sky, and the air waves rolled like a tide. In the face of this explosive power, the hard floor was easily lifted up. "Elder Ba!" A short exclamation sounded. It was Josiah who saw Elder Ba's figure being blown into the shadow of the corner by the airwaves. Then, a few arrows followed like shadows and sank into the shadow. Bang! Tang Yin's speed was pushed to the limit, and before the airwaves reached him, he broke through the wall of a house on the side of the road and rushed in. Without waiting for a rest, he rushed in again, smashing through several walls in a row. His footsteps paused. Tang Yin put down Josiah, flipped his hand, and lit up a dagger. He hurriedly said, "They are coming for us. You go and save Elder Ba. Be careful. There are demon-piercing arrows." Not many people knew that Josiah was a magician, and most of them were internal members of the secret organization. But just now, there were traces of demon-piercing arrows in the first round of arrow rain. It was obvious that this group of people was coming for them. After saying that, Tang Yin lightly jumped out from the side of the window. With one foot on the window lattice, he grabbed onto the eaves and flipped over. When he poked his head out, the arrow rain had stopped. There were dozens of figures with all kinds of weapons pouncing on this side, showing that they were going to chase them to the end. "Interesting." Murmuring in a low voice, Tang Yin's eyes flashed with killing intent. He silently stepped on the roof tiles and ran to the west. As if it was timed perfectly, a burly man dressed in black had just turned around the corner when he saw a black shadow in front of him. What was even faster than that was a cold light that was aimed at his throat. "Here." "Ugh." "Hiss." The warning was short and hurried, followed by a series of meaningless words. He staggered a few steps and missed a step. The man in black simply fell from the roof with a dull thud. "Over there, surround him." Hearing the commotion, the men in black scattered on the roof all turned their heads and saw a black shadow flash past the eaves. They quickly surrounded him. Because of the previous ambush, the men in black were standing in a more relaxed position. It could be said that no matter where that person went, he would inevitably be surrounded. "Down there, stop him." Ding ding. Clang. The first man in black to arrive saw the black shadow falling down the alley and hurriedly ordered the people there to block it. But after a few sounds of weapons clashing and falling to the ground, when he turned around, there was no trace of the black shadow. He saw that the chest, thighs, wrists, blood was spurting out from all parts of his body. It was obvious that he was not going to survive. Damn it, isn't he a magician? The man in black was shocked when he saw this scene. In such a short time, and at such a close distance, the effect in front of him was obviously not something that a magician who was not good at close combat could do. "Oh, who told you?" A faint voice made the man in black tremble. He saw a black shadow quickly turn from behind his bleeding companion, and in an instant, it was in front of him. He subconsciously swung his sword vertically, but it missed. He took advantage of the momentum and swung his sword horizontally, but it missed. There's a magician here? Retreat, attack, retreat, retreat, retreat. At such a close distance, there was no time to use combat energy, let alone answer the question. The man in black wanted to distance himself and let the sword have space to swing. But when he took a step back, the cold light of the sword suddenly filled his vision. He could only retreat step by step. However, before he could even take 5 steps back, the ghostly shadow instantly closed in on him, cut his wrist, and flicked his saber away. In that short moment, before the black-clothed man could figure out what was going on, his line of defense was instantly broken. His vision turned black, and he fell to the ground. Retracting his left hand, Tang In looked coldly at the unconscious man in black. "I'll let you talk eventually." After saying this, he suddenly looked up and met the eyes of the man in black who came from behind the roof. The corner of his mouth pulled into a cold arc. His figure retreated and fell into the darkness behind him. You're tuning into the Warrior Lore YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.